All right, let's discuss this passage, which is about literature. This book takes the position that setting in literature is more than just backdrop, that important insight into literary texts can be made by paying close attention to how authors craft place as well as to how place functions in a narrative. Okay, so the passage starts by talking about the importance of place in literature, right? That place is very important. Setting and place is being used synonymously here. That it's very important, and by paying close attention to place, important insights into literary texts can be made. The authors included in this reference work engage deeply with either real or imagined geographies. Now, when it says this reference work, that means this RC is part of a reference work, right? This reference work is talking about authors that engage deeply with place again, real or imagined geographies, right? So real geographies is pretty clear. Imagined could be anything. We'll see what it is. They care about how human decisions have shaped landscapes and how landscapes have shaped human practices and values. Some of the best writing is highly vivid, employing the language of the senses because this is the primary means through which humans know physical space. So again, what is the main point of this paragraph? It is about the importance of place in literature and how certain authors, especially the ones that have been referred to in this reference work, pay a lot of attention to place because they believe that landscapes shape human practices and values and human decisions shape landscapes, right? So place is very, very important according to them. And also the last sentence says the nature of their writing is very vivid. Vivid meaning very descriptive, very visual, which makes sense because they're describing place. So it has to be vivid and descriptive. Okay, let's continue. Literature can offer valuable perspectives on physical and cultural geography. Unlike scientific reports, a literary narrative can provide the emotional component missing from the scientific record. Okay, great. So, what is the role that literature plays when it comes to geography, right? So while science or scientific disciplines can offer the physical component, literature can provide the much needed emotional component, right? When it comes to geography, which of course science can't provide. That's what the author is saying. In human experience, geographical places have a spiritual or emotional component in addition to and as part of a physical layout and topography. Very interesting. Okay, so what the author is saying is that for humans or for human experience, geography is not just physical. There is an emotional component, there is a spiritual component. The emotional component, although subjective, is no less real than a survey's map. Human consciousness of place is experienced in a multimodal manner. Histories of places live on in many forms, one of which is the human memory or imagination. So this paragraph is talking about basically two things. One, how literature offers the emotional component when it comes to geography. So while science can provide the physical component, literature provides the emotional component. And how for humans, geographical places they're not just limited to the physical component. There is a substantial, significant emotional or spiritual component of a geographical place as far as the human experience is concerned. It is subjective, but the author also says it's no less real than a map. So basically signifying the importance of the emotional component of a place. And if you think about it, if you relate it to your experience, any place, any geographical place, if you think of it, think of the hometown that you grew up in, right? Of course, there is a physical component, but there is a huge emotional component as well, which resides in our memory. That's what the author is referring to. Both real and imaginary landscapes provide insight into the human experience of place. So now it's clear what imaginary landscape is. Imaginary landscape is the landscape that lives in the mind of a human being, in the memory of a human being, pertaining to the emotional component. So both of them provide insight into the human experience of place. Both are important. The pursuit of such a topic speaks to the valuable knowledge produced from bridging disciplines and combining material from both the arts and the sciences to better understand the human condition. Now connect the dots with what we have discussed so far. It is the bridging of disciplines. It is the bridging of arts and science, because while science, in the second paragraph, the author clearly said science provides the physical component, arts provides the emotional component, literature is arts. Right? So it's important. The pursuit of such a topic signifies that it's important to bridge these disciplines in order to better and completely understand the human condition. The perspectives that most concern culture geographers are often those regarding movement and migration, cultivation of natural resources, and organization of space. We're talking about cultural geographers here that look at geography from a cultural perspective. What are the things that are important from them? Of course, movement and migration, because culture is mostly about people, cultivation of natural resources, and organization of space. This is what cultural geographers look for. The latter two, meaning cultivation of natural resources and organization of space, the latter two reflect concerns of the built environment, a topic shared with the field of architectural study. Many of these concerns are also reflected in work sociologists do. Scholars from literary studies can contribute an aesthetic dimension to what might otherwise be a purely ideological approach. So again, this paragraph focuses on bridging the disciplines of art and science. The author implies that it's very important to bridge these disciplines if you want to get a complete picture of human condition. If you want to understand human experience completely, you can't just limit yourself to the physical part. You have to bring in the emotional and spiritual part as well, which literature gives you. So again, bridging of disciplines is very important. That's what the paragraph is focusing on. So see here, it also talks about how these disciplines intersect, or how they kind of feed into each other, right? You have architecture, which has been connected to cultural geography, which has been connected to sociology, which has been connected to literature, right? So there's a lot of intersection between all these dimensions. And through this, the author is again signifying that it's important to bridge disciplines, especially the ones coming from arts and science. Let's continue. Literature can bring together material that spans different branches of science. Okay, very interesting. For example, a literary description of place may involve not only the environment and geography, but the noises and quality of light, or how people from different races or classes can experience the same place in different ways linked to those racial or class disparities. So here the author has given you an example of how literature can bring together different branches of science. Right? So not just description of place or the environment, but the noises and quality of light, how people from different races or classes can experience, how their experiences are different. So that's the importance of literature, right? And now by now you would have realized that the RC focuses on literature a lot, right? And the importance of literature. And now the author is saying it actually has the capability to bring in different branches of science as well. Literary text can also account for the way in which absence of other people, animals, and so on affects a human observer or inhabitant. Both literary and scientific approaches to place are necessary, working in unison to achieve a complete record of an environment. Now, this is also a point that has been repeated again, right? That it's important. Now, again, remember, literature is art. So again, the author is saying it's very important to bring in arts and science together if you want to get a complete picture of the human environment, condition, and experience. It is important to note that the interdisciplinary nature of the work teaches us that landscapes are not static, that they're not unchanged by human culture. Again, the interdisciplinary component comes in, which is very important here. It's coming up again and again. And what does it teach us? What does the fact that this is interdisciplinary teaches us? The fact that it's a combination of arts and science teaches us that landscapes are not just static. If it was only science, they would have been static. But the fact that you have arts as well in it, it teaches us that landscapes are not static. They are changed by human culture. Human culture does change landscape, and this is true, right? Any kind of human settlement in any geography will have an impact on the landscape, will change the landscape, right? At least part of their identity. Part of their identity here means the identity of the landscape. At least part of their identity derives from the people who inhabit them and from the way space can alter and inspire human perspective. So it's vice versa, right? So humans have an impact on geographical landscapes. Geographical landscapes have an impact on humans as well. The intersection of scientific and literary expression, again, that point comes up, that happens in the study of literary geography is of prime importance due to the complexity of the personal and political ways that human experience plays. Okay. So again, if you look at this RC, what are the most important keywords here, right? Literature, definitely, because it is about literature. Literary geography comes in, and that's what the RC is talking about, right? Then how literature provides the emotional component. While science provides the physical component of geography, literature provides the emotional component. And the bridging of both, you have to consider both in combination in order to completely understand the human experience, right, or the environment. And broadly speaking, the RC really focuses on the interdisciplinary nature, on the bridging of the arts and scientific disciplines. So literary geographers, right, want to get a complete picture of the human condition. They have to bring in together arts and science. They have to bring in the scientific disciplines, and they have to bring in the literature, arts, the emotional component of it as well, so that they can give a complete picture of the human condition. And that's what the main idea is all about. Okay, so I've sort of jotted down the main idea. Again, it's a little detailed. Of course, you don't have to come up with such a detailed main idea, but you should have a broad main idea in your head after reading the RC before you go to the questions, because that main idea will really help you to solve all questions. So let's go through this. The main idea is all about, it says the human experience of place is influenced by geography, definitely, particularly through how place is experienced and represented. In order to understand this fully, the human experience of place, it is important to consider both the physical and emotional components of geography. Science provides the physical component, literature provides the missing sensory and emotional dimensions. This is it's a very important point as far as the RC is concerned. Offering deeper insight into how humans perceive and relate to place. It's important to bridge the disciplines of arts and science to better understand human experience of place, and literary geography enables this, right? This is what the main idea is. This is the crux of the passage. The interdisciplinary nature of this approach shows that landscapes are not static, but they are shaped by human culture, highlighting the importance of integrating arts and science in literary geography, right? So very, very important to talk about the bridging of the arts and science disciplines, because that is the focus of the RC, right? So again, the keywords would be literature, literary geography. Literature is a broad term. The emotional component of geography, which literature provides, and the bridging of the arts and science disciplines, or alternatively, the interdisciplinary nature of this approach. All right, let's look at this question. All of the following statements, if false, would contradict the arguments in the passage except that. Now, this question stem can be a little tricky, but you have to get used to this question stem because it's quite common in CAT. So there is a certain way to solve this, which you should understand. Whenever there is if false, the best way to solve this question is to turn it into if true. So you turn the question on its head, because if you go with if false, you'll have to falsify each option and then figure it out, which becomes very difficult and time consuming and tricky as well. So it's best to turn the question on its head, make it if true. Now, how do we make it if true? Just learn it once, practice, and then you'll be fine. So it says if false would contradict the arguments, and there is except also. Don't consider the except now. We'll bring in the except at the end. Let's just look at if false would contradict. So we have false and we have contradict. Okay, turn the question on its head, make this true, and of course, since you're changing the left hand side, you'll have to change the right hand side as well. So this will become not contradict. Okay, this is the same thing. So whether you solve it as false contradict or true not contradict, it's the same thing. Now, the advantage of making it true is you won't have to falsify the options, because if true means we consider the options as it is. We don't have to change the options. And it's the same thing. Okay, so write it down on your notepad. In the exam also you should do that. We're looking for true not contradict. Okay, now let's bring in except at the end. So this is our question: true not contradict except. Except basically means except one. Okay, so you have among these options, there are three options which don't contradict the arguments in the passage. One option contradicts the arguments in the passage. Again, I'll repeat it. We have to do this because there is except. Okay, so except basically means except one, right? So one option will be different from the other three options. Now, what does that mean? Three options will not contradict the arguments in the passage. One option will contradict the arguments in the passage, and our job is to pick the option that contradicts. Okay, again, write this down on your notepad, and remember, we are looking for the option that contradicts the arguments in the passage. Three options: don't contradict, not contradict, but it's except. So we're looking for the option that contradicts, right? So write that down and let's solve it. Okay. Option A, highly vivid writing employing the language of the senses can capture the multimodal manner in which humans experience places. Now, this should give you a trigger if you've read the passage effectively that multimodal, highly vivid writing has been mentioned somewhere in the first or second paragraph. Let's go back. Okay. Now, it's here. If you read this, it clearly says some of the best writing is highly vivid, employing the language of the senses, because this is the primary means through which humans know physical space. Vivid means descriptive, and it can mean visual as well. So this option is saying the same thing. Highly vivid writing, employing the language of the senses, can capture the multimodal manner in which humans experience places. This does not contradict the arguments in the passage. We are looking for contradicts, so this is not our answer. Okay, let's look at B. Descriptions of places do not need satellite imagery or other visual aids to give a real sense of the place. Now, this option can be a little tricky, but notice how real is mentioned in double quotes. Okay, in the passage also somewhere we had real mentioned in double quotes. Okay, the passage doesn't really talk about satellite imagery, but the section of the passage definitely talks about real sense of the place. So this option is saying that we don't need, descriptions of places do not need satellite imagery or other visual aids to give a real sense of the place. So let's go back to where the author was talking about real. It's here. Okay, read this carefully. This option can be tricky. Let's understand this. This emotional component, the emotional component provided through literature, although subjective, is no less real than a surveyor's map. What does the statement mean? That means the emotional component can give you a real sense of the place, like a map gives you a real sense of the place, right? A map describes a place very clearly. Okay, it's a visual of the place. So that is a real visual of the place. So what the author is saying is that emotional component that literature provides, it can be subjective, but it is as real as a map. Okay, it can give you a real sense of the place. Now they look at reality from different perspectives, right? Because a map belongs to, it can be considered scientific. So that's like the physical aspect of the place. Literature is giving you the emotional aspect of the place. So they're looking at reality from different perspectives, but both are real. That's what the sentence means. Let's go back. Descriptions of place do not need satellite imagery or other visual aids to give a real sense of the place. This is true. They don't need it, because you can get a real sense of the place through the emotional component. You don't absolutely need visual. Now, map is a visual aid. Satellite imagery is also similar to that, right? You don't need that. You have your emotional component, which can give you a real sense of the place. Okay, so is this option true for the passage? Yes, so it does not contradict. Okay, so again, understand this is a little tricky. What's important to note here is they're looking at reality from different aspects. Both can give you a real sense of the place. The perspective is different, but you don't, if you have the emotional component, that can be enough. You don't need it. You don't absolutely need that if you're just looking at the emotional perspective. Okay, so this does not contradict. This can be a little tricky. Okay. All right, let's look at option C. Literature provides us with deep insights into the ways in which movement and migration affect physical geography. All right, now there is no clear place in the passage that sort of where you can draw this inference from. You have to draw this inference from multiple aspects. See, literature is connected to movement and migration because there is a part in the passage which talks about cultural geographers and migration. Okay, let's look at that. Right, the perspectives that most concern cultural geographers are often those regarding movement and migration, cultivation of natural resources, blah blah blah. So this is where movement and migration has been spoken about. Okay, and it's connected to cultural geographers. It is connected to literature. Also, in the last paragraph, it clearly says that it is important to note that the interdisciplinary nature of the work teaches us that landscapes are not static, they are not unchanged by human culture. Human culture ends up changing the landscape. Movement and migration is a part of human culture. So that will also impact your landscape, and cultural geography is related to literature. So you have to draw this inference from different aspects of Tarsi. So does literature provide us with deep insights into the ways in which movement and migration affect physical geography? Yes, this can be inferred. This does not contradict the arguments in the passage. Remember, we're looking for contradicts. Okay, let's look at option D. Humans do not interact with places in subjective emotional ways because places are only physical topography. This is clearly contradicting the arguments in the passage. The author clearly says that the emotional aspect of the place can be subjective. It is real, but it can be subjective. Clearly says the emotional component, although subjective. Okay, and humans experiences place in different ways depending on their situation, and it lives in their memory. It is imagined, so it is subjective. So it's definitely not static. Here it says humans do not interact with place in subjective. This is absolutely contradicting what the passage is saying. So we're looking for contradicts, and hence this is our answer. Okay, this question I would say is medium to difficult. Okay, and the reason I'm saying this is it's not medium because of option B. Option B can throw you off. So you have to spend a little bit of time to understand what the author means by real. Okay, that's important. All right. Okay, let's look at question 2. Which one of the following is a valid conclusion to draw from the author's statement that, and it's given in double quotes, that means this has been picked up from the RC. Okay, we have to understand the statement and draw a valid conclusion from it. Let's see the statement. The pursuit of such a topic speaks to the valuable knowledge produced from bridging disciplines and combining material from both the arts and the sciences to better understand the human condition. Now, we have to build a shadow answer here. Okay, so you go back to the passage, don't look at options directly. Go back to the passage, see where this has been mentioned. Okay, it has been mentioned here. Always when there is a specific question like that, read it with context. Read the lines above, read the lines below. Don't just stick to what has been given to you in the question. Sometimes the context is very important. So what does it say here? Both real and imaginary landscapes provide an insight into the human experience of place. The pursuit of such a topic speaks to the valuable knowledge produced from bridging disciplines. Here we're talking about bridging arts and science. Literature belongs to art. Remember, literature provides emotional component, science provides physical component, and combining material from both the arts and sciences to better understand the human condition. So what this statement is telling us, that to get a complete picture of the human condition, you have to bridge the arts and science disciplines, you have to bridge the physical and emotional components. So let's look at that. That's the conclusion that you would draw. This is a shadow answer, a broad answer that you create in your head without looking at the options. Now look at the options. When you create a shadow answer, the options won't confuse you as much. So wherever possible, you should create a shadow answer. Okay, let's look at this. Option A, a comprehensive understanding of the valuable knowledge produced by the arts and sciences can best be achieved by studying the human condition. This is convoluted. It says comprehensive understanding of the valuable knowledge produced by the arts and sciences can best be achieved by studying the human condition. This is not what we're saying. Okay, what we are saying is that in order to get a complete picture of the human condition, we should bridge arts and sciences. Okay, so this is kind of like inverting it. It says can best be achieved by studying the human condition. We're not studying the human condition to achieve the intersection of arts and science, right? We are saying in order to get a complete picture of the human condition, we should bridge arts and sciences. This is convoluted. This is not correct. Okay, be careful. The literary descriptions of the emotions we experience in the places we visit can contribute to our understanding of the arts and sciences. This is completely wrong. We're not looking to understand arts and sciences. We're looking to understand the human condition by intersecting arts and sciences. This is convoluted again. A comprehensive bridging of the human condition can best be achieved by a disciplined pursuit of human understanding. Why are we bridging human condition? We're not bridging human condition, we're bridging the disciplines of arts and science. It's convoluted again. A comprehensive understanding of the human condition can best be achieved by combining the findings of disciplines from the arts and sciences. Absolutely correct. This is what we're looking at. We're looking to bridge arts and science in order to understand the human condition completely, and that's what that statement is saying. This is indeed the right answer. I would say this is a medium difficulty question. If you created the shadow answer and did it properly, you can get 3 marks here. All right. Let's look at question 3. Which one of the following is not true of the argument in the second paragraph? Now, I always tell my students, please read the questions and options like a child. Don't read the passage like a child. Passage should be read effectively. When it comes to questions and options, Read each and every word, because if you miss out on one word, the question will go wrong. Now here, if you don't read not true, you can get the question wrong, and that happens. Okay, so which one of the following is not true of the argument in the second paragraph? It's a specific question. That means 3 options are true for the second paragraph. 1 option is not true. Our job is to pick the one which is not true. What you should do first is you should quickly go back, shadow answer again, reread the second paragraph again quickly. Okay, and depending on your understanding the first time when you read the passage, you can quickly read it. Okay, all right, let's see. What does it say? So second paragraph was talking about literature providing valuable perspectives on physical and cultural geography. Correct. Then, of course, the main important point was science provides the physical component, literature provides the emotional component. How emotional component is very significant, is real, is no less real than a survey's map. Those were the important points. But I think the most important point here is about literature providing the emotional component, which can be subjective and which is as real as a survey's map. That's what the second paragraph was talking about. So quickly get an understanding, and then go back to the question, and let's look for the option which is not true for the second paragraph. Literary accounts of places can be filled with histories manifested as memory or imagination. Yes, this comes from the last line, which is about the multimodal manner. Okay, this is where the evidence is for that question. Let's go back. This is true for the second paragraph. This is not our answer. The spiritual experience of a place may be considered as real as the physical experience of it. Yes, true. It is as real as it. They're looking at it from different perspectives. Now, this is again, the former question was also looking at that. Is the spiritual experience as real as the physical experience? Yes, absolutely. Okay, it is as real, because it says it's no less real than a survey's map. They're looking at it from different perspectives, but they're both real. That's what the author is saying, right? So emotional, spiritual here is being used synonymously. Please understand that. So yes, this is true. This is not our answer. Analyzing the literary descriptions of a place can give us a sense of how people relate emotionally to it. Absolutely yes. The literary part, the literature part is connected to the emotional experience, and that's what the paragraph is saying. This is also true for the second paragraph. Let's look at D. The emotional and spiritual experience of a place can replace a survey's map. Now, this is where it gets tricky. It says it is as real as a survey's map, but can it replace it? Think about it. What does a map do? A map gives you the physical representation, the visual representation of a place, gives you direction, helps you navigate. Can the emotional and spiritual experience replace that? No. That's why it's important to understand they're both real according to the author, but they're looking at reality from different perspectives. That doesn't mean the emotional experience can replace the map, or vice versa. The map can't replace the emotional experience. Why do you think the author is saying that we need both science and arts here? We both need science and literature. If one could replace the other, then why did we need both? Right? So that's why this is a little tricky. That part of the paragraph can be tricky. Please understand that they are as real, but that does not mean that it can replace a map or the map can replace the emotional component. We need both because they're looking at reality from two different perspectives. Okay, so this is not true for the passage. I would also say this is medium to difficult, slightly towards the difficult side because of that whole interpretation of reality in the second paragraph. Okay, all right, so the answer is D again. If you notice, all the first 3 questions were all D, but again, that doesn't mean anything, right? Okay, let's look at question 4. The author uses the example of the literary description of place to illustrate that. Now, it says uses the example of the literary description. That's why it's important to read the passage effectively. You should get a trigger that there was an example of literary description somewhere. Again, don't go to the options directly. Create a shadow answer. Go back and look where is the author talking about the example of a literary description. Okay, there you go. Talks about the example here. Understand what the example is being used for. Create a shadow answer in your head and then come to the options. Okay, so let's see that. Literature can bring together material that spans different branches of science, correct? For example, a literary description of place may involve not only the environment and geography, but the noises and quality of light, or how people from different races or classes can experience the same place in different ways, linked to those racial or class disparities. Correct. So The author is saying that literature can amalgamate different branches of science. So we're not just looking at the environment or the geography. We're also looking at noises and quality of light, which can pertain to physics, or how people from different races or classes can experience the same place. So different branches of science can be brought together in literature, right? That's what the author is saying here. So understand that why has the example been given to you, right? And it also says how people from different races or classes can experience the same place in different ways linked to those racial or class disparities. So it brings together different branches of science. It also talks about how people from different races or classes, the same place can be experienced in different ways. And this is true if you think about it, right? The rich experience, if you take the Ambanis, right? Ambani's experience Bombay in a very different way than a person staying in Dharavi in the slums, obviously, right? So the same place, same Bombay, same city can be experienced in different ways by people from different races or classes. This happens to races as well. Okay. All right. Let's go back. Okay. All right. Let's look at the options. So we are looking for why has the author used this example, or what is the author trying to illustrate using this example? A, literature can convey how different people experience the same place differently. Yeah, this is true. This is true. Okay, let's park it. Why are we parking? Because we haven't looked at B, C, and D. Architects use diverse methods to calibrate the noises and lights of a given place. No, this is not the point that the author is trying to make through the example. The question is asking, why is the author using this example? The author is not using the example to talk about architects. This is definitely not the answer. The absence of other people, animals, and so in a place can profoundly affect its inhabitants. Now, this can be a little tricky. Go back. If you read further, right, it says literary texts can also account for the way in which absence of other people, animals, and so on affects a human observer or inhabitant. This point has been given. But the author is not using the example to illustrate this point. The author is using the example, a literary description of a place to highlight two things, as we have discussed, different branches of science coming together in literature and how people experience the same place in different ways because of their condition. This part is not related to the example. It's given there, but it's not related to the example. Okay, so let's go back. Don't get confused. This is consistent for the paragraph, but this is not why the author is using the examples. This is also, you need to understand this in CAT. Sometimes the options will be consistent for the RC that has been given to you. But is it answering the question? It's not answering the question, right? Because the question is asking, why has the author used this example? So that information is consistent, but it doesn't answer the question. So it's not the answer. Be careful of that. Scientific approaches to place are more accurate than literary ones. This is absolutely not what the author is saying. They're both required. They're both real. The author doesn't say one is more accurate than the other. The author's point is that they're looking at it from different angles. The answer to this question is A. Okay, again, this would be a medium to difficult question. All right, folks, let's discuss this passage, which was about tetra fish. Time and again, whenever a population of Mexican tetra fish was swept into a cave and survived long enough for natural selection to have its way, the eyes disappeared. Very interesting. Okay, so whenever this fish, Mexican tetra fish, swept into a cave, their eyes disappeared. It's a very interesting start to the passage. So we'll understand later as to why the eyes disappeared. But it's not that everything has been lost in cave fish. Many enhancements have also happened. Studies have found that cave-dwelling fish can detect lower levels of amino acids than surface fish can. They also have more taste buds and a higher density of sensitive cells alongside their bodies that let them sense water pressure and flow. Now, what is important here to understand is that they are talking about some kind of changes in tetra fish whenever they sweep into a cave, whenever they go into a cave. So there are some losses, or there are some negative changes, and there are some positive changes. And why is that happening? That's happening because of natural selection. It's a very important concept for you to understand, because natural selection seems to be like one of the favorite topics of CAT question setters. If you see past year paper passages, natural selection has appeared quite a bit. So you should understand at the very basic level what natural selection is. And natural selection is closely connected to evolution. Okay, so how certain species get phased out because of evolution and certain species are preferred. So evolution prefers species that have more chances of producing offspring. That's how evolution works at the very basic level, and that's what natural selection is. Nature is selecting the species based on their ability to produce offspring. Okay, and in connection to that, nature also prefers traits in species. To support species to produce offspring, favorable traits are preferred. So nature will prefer favorable traits and phase out traits that are not favorable to help species produce more offspring, to help animals produce more offspring. So that's how nature selects species and also traits in them, and that's what natural selection is at a very basic level. But definitely look it up and get an understanding of it if you don't already have that. So what's happening here is, because of natural selection, their eyes are disappearing whenever they sweep into a cave, but also there are enhancements, right? They can detect lower levels of amino acids, they have more density of sensitive cells, so that's also happening. So number of changes, both positive and negative. That's the main point of this first paragraph. Let's continue. Killing the processes that support the formation of the eye is quite literally what happens. So now the author is focusing on the part that, on the aspect that the eye disappears, right? Just like non-cave dwelling members of the species, all cavefish embryos start making eyes. Interesting. So the eye, they start making eyes. Even the cavefish, where the eyes ultimately disappear, they do start making eyes. The embryos do start making eyes, just like their non-cave dwelling members. So that process starts in them, but then the eyes somehow disappear. But after a few hours, cells in the developing eye start dying until the entire structure has disappeared. Interesting. So they lose their eyes. So the process does start in the embryo for a few hours, but then it disappears. Developmental biologist Riddle thinks this apparent inefficiency may be unavoidable. It is inefficient, right? I mean, if the eyes are going to be lost in few hours, then why is the organism starting the process? So that's why the author is calling it an inefficiency, right? It's starting and stopping in a few hours. So what's the point? Why this inefficiency, right? But Riddle thinks this apparent inefficiency may be unavoidable. The early development of the brain and the eye are completely intertwined, interconnected. They happen together, she says. That means the least disruptive way for eyelessness to evolve may be to start making an eye and then get rid of it. So understand that. That's an important point in this paragraph, right? The process starts in the cave dwelling fish as well, Tetra fish as well, but it disappears in a few hours and the eye disappears. And the author thinks that this inefficiency may be unavoidable because the process of building an eye and the brain processes are very interconnected to each other, right? And because of that interconnection, this is the way to go about it. Because if, let's say for instance, again that's not very clear here, but what the author says is that the least disruptive way for eyelessness, because if two processes are so closely connected, the eye and the brain, if you kill one process completely, then it will affect the brain process as well. So in order to sort of prevent that impact potentially, this is why it's happening, right? But what we need to understand is that according to Riddle, this is the least disruptive way for eyelessness to appear. The process starts and then stops in a few hours. Okay, very interesting passage if you think about it. Let's continue. It's easy to see why cavefish would be at a disadvantage if they were to maintain expensive tissues they aren't using. Now, of course, understand, connected with the previous paragraph, the author is talking about eye, right? I mean, it's understandable why they don't maintain the eye, because they're not using it, right? They're not using the eye in the cave, so that's why they're not maintaining it. Because if an organism is maintaining a process that they're not using, it's expensive on the organism. So it's just no point. It makes sense. What the author is saying, it's easy to understand as to why they don't maintain those tissues, referring to the eye tissues. Okay. Since relatively little lives or grows in their caves, the fish are likely surviving on a meager diet of mostly bat feces and organic waste that washes in during the rainy season. Of course, the cave, there is very little or grows inside a dark cave. So what these cave-dwelling tetrafish are surviving on is just residue, right? A very meager diet of bat feces and organic waste. I mean, think about it, right? Imagine an organism surviving on that. But that's what it is, right? Because they're living in the cave, that's their habitat, there's hardly anything available. Researchers keeping cavefish in labs have discovered that genetically, the creatures are exquisitely adapted to absorbing and storing nutrients. Now understand why the author is saying this. Why are they genetically adapted to absorbing and storing nutrients? They get very little food to eat because they live in a cave. The habitat is such that there's very little for them to eat. So they're surviving on that residue. So whenever they get food, they absorb those nutrients. Right? They're absorbing it in their body, they're retaining it into the body so that they can survive for longer because they don't get food frequently. Food is not abundant in a cave. Okay, so this is where the passage starts getting analytical, and that's why it's an interesting passage, but it's also analytical. Right? So you'll have to expose yourself to such writing so that you can understand it quickly. But this is quite analytical. There are quite a lot of inferences that you'll have to make as you're reading. Okay, so understand that here the main point is that they are storing nutrients because there's very little food available for them. So whenever they get food, they store it so that they can use it in future. They can retain that in future. Okay, let's continue. Okay, fats can be toxic for tissues. Evolutionary physiologist Nicholas Roner explains. So they are stored in fat cells. Okay, so fats are toxic for tissues and hence they're stored in fat cells. All right. But when these cells get too big, they can burst, which is why we often see chronic inflammation in humans and other animals that have stored a lot of fat in their tissues. Okay, so fat can be toxic. Too much fat is not good, and that's true for humans as well. So what the author is saying is when the cells get too big, right, when there's too much fat in them, the cells burst, and that causes chronic inflammation, which, as we know, most of you would know, it's really, really bad for humans and apparently other species as well. Yet a 2020 study by Rona, Krishnan and their colleagues revealed that even very well-fed cavefish had fewer signs of inflammation in their fat tissues than surface fish do. Okay, so that's interesting. So even well-fed cavefish that were well-fed, they had fewer signs of inflammation in their fat tissues, which is interesting, is what the author is saying. Okay. Even in their sparse cave condition, wild cavefish can sometimes get very fat, says Riddle. That's interesting. This is presumably because whenever food ends up in the cave, the fish eat as much of it as possible since there may be nothing else for a long time to come. Interesting, because these fish have very little diet around them. The moment they get food, they consume a lot of it because the tendency for the fish is, they're wired that way. They're wired that way. They know that not a lot of, their body knows, the organism knows that not a lot of food is available. So when they get some food, or let's say a lot of food, they consume it very quickly. And that tends to make them fat at times because they're consuming a lot of food in a very short period of time. Okay. Right. Intriguingly, Riddle says their fat is usually bright yellow because of high levels of carotenoids, right? The substance in the carrots that your grandmother used to tell you were good for your eyes. It's very interesting. This is actually, if you look at the figure of speech here, this is what we call an irony. It's contradictory. Carotenoids, I'm probably mispronouncing it, apologies for that. Carotenoids, I'm just going to call it carotenoids, right? So carotenoids are found in carrots that your grandmother, knowledge like our parents and grandmothers used to tell you it's good for eyes. But why are these fish, why do they have high levels of carotenoids? They don't have eyes. So why do they have carotenoids? That's the irony, that's the contradiction here. Okay, so I'm just pointing out it's ironical. Okay, you should understand what irony is. It's important from a cat perspective. If you see many passages, there have even been questions around irony. So you should understand this figure of speech. So it's a contradiction at a very simple level. They have high levels of carotenoids, but they don't have eyes. And carotenoids are in carrots, which are supposed to be good for eyes. So the author is wondering, why do they have high levels of carotenoids when they don't have eyes? Okay, right. So let's try to understand the main point of this paragraph. See, the inflammation part is very important. What you need to understand is that these cavefish, in spite of a meager diet around them, they can get very fat because they tend to hog food, right? Hoard food. The moment they get food, even if it's a lot of food, they'll just quickly eat it because the organism is wired in such a way that they may not get food in future. So they grab that food and sometimes they tend to get very fat. But in spite of them being fat, there is little inflammation. And that's what the author is saying. They show fewer signs of inflammation, and that's what the author is wondering. If they are fat, then why is inflammation low? Okay, so that's one point, that's one question in this paragraph. And the second one is where the author ends by saying that intriguingly their fat is usually bright yellow, which is because of high levels of carotenoids, right? And the author is wondering, why do they have high levels of carotenoids? Because carotenoids are found in carrots, which are supposed to be good for eyes. So there are 2 points there. Okay, keep that in mind. Again, this is good, it gets quite analytical here. Okay, let's continue. But the question in that paragraph, and understand that the main question is that these cavefish can get fat, but why do they still have lower levels of inflammation? What is the reason behind that? Okay, that's what the author is wondering in that paragraph. The first thing that came to our mind, of course, was that they were accumulating these because they don't have eyes. So they were accumulating carotenoids because they don't have eyes. That's also a question, right? Why do they have high levels of carotenoids when they don't have eyes? So the first thing that came to our mind, says Riddle, while they were researching, is that they're probably accumulating this because they don't have eyes. Carotenoids are good for eyes. So let's say carotenoids are used for eyes, potentially used for eyes. Since they don't have eyes, it's not being used, and that's why they're accumulating it. So that was the first hypothesis that Riddle and his team had. In these species, such ideas can be tested. So they tested that. Scientists can cross surface fish with eyes and cavefish without eyes. Okay, so they mated them, cross is mating, and look at what their offspring are like. So they did an experiment to figure this out, to test their hypothesis. When that's done, Riddle says researchers see no link between eye presence or size and the accumulation of carotenoids. Interesting. So they ruled out that hypothesis. What was the hypothesis? The hypothesis is that they have high levels of carotenoid because they don't have eyes. The eyes are not using them, so they're high levels of carotenoids. But they ruled that out by mating cross surface fish and cavefish. They mated them and they found no link between eye presence or size and the accumulation of carotenoids. So there was no link. So the question still remains, why do they have high levels of carotenoids? The first hypothesis has been ruled out. Understand that. Some eyeless cavefish had fat that was practically white, okay, indicating lower carotenoid levels. So some eyeless cavefish actually had white fat and they had low levels of carotenoid, okay. Instead, Riddle thinks these carotenoids may be another adaptation to suppress inflammation, which might be important in the wild as cavefish are likely overeating whenever food arrives. Now, this is a very important sentence because it's answering the main question in this paragraph. Remember, the question was, these cavefish can get fat, but then still when they are fat, why do they have lower levels of inflammation? In the end, the author says that Riddle thinks that this might be due to carotenoids. The carotenoids that are there in their body, the yellow fat, high levels of carotenoids may be suppressing inflammation, There's no conclusive answer here. Okay, so Riddle thinks these carotenoids may be another adaptation to suppress inflammation. So that's second hypothesis. The first hypothesis has been ruled out, which might be important in the wild as cavefish are likely overeating whenever food arrives. We already know that. Okay, very interesting passage, quite analytical in nature, number of inferences. In fact, when you get used to reading cat passages, right, and this will happen to you as well if you practice a lot and read a lot. When you're reading a passage, your brain starts sort of wondering, okay, I'm sure there's a question in this paragraph because it's so sort of inferential in nature or analytical in nature, right? Okay, so let's understand the main idea here. So I have it written here. See, the main idea, the first point is that cave-dwelling Mexican Tetra fish lose their eyes through natural selection. That's very important, natural selection. Because of natural selection, they lose their eyes, with eye development being curtailed in a way that may be least disruptive to other processes. We understood that as well. Their eyes disappear, but the process starts and in a few hours disappears, and that's because it is least disruptive because of the connection with the brain processes. Remember that, okay? Now comes their diet, which is very important, right? And how they sort of store food and get fat. Since very little lives and grows in the caves, they survive on a meager diet and adapted to efficiently absorbing and storing nutrients, right? Which leads them to a tendency to get very fat. But in spite of being fat, they show fewer signs of inflammation. And Riddle, the main researcher, being the scientist being quoted in the passage, thinks that according to the biologist Riddle, this might be due to high levels of carotenoids, which may help suppress inflammation. This part is the most important one as far as the main idea is concerned. The question that the author has, they are fat, but they still have low level of inflammation. Why is that? And then the hypothesis that this might be due to carotenoids, which might be suppressing inflammation. All right, very interesting passage. And the questions, as you will see as well, are quite interesting. They're tricky. The questions are tricky because it's analytical in nature. So the question setter has understandably focused on those aspects, but very interesting questions nevertheless. All right, let's look at question 1 of the tetrafish passage. All of the following statements from the passage describe adaptation in Mexican tetrafish except. Okay, so it's an except question. So again, you should be very familiar with except questions because they're very common in CAT. The best way to, if you're confused, the best way to solve an except question is that you break it up. You first look at the question without except. Okay, so it says all of the following statements from the passage describe adaptation. All of them describe adaptation. Now bring in except. So except basically means except one. So what this means is 3 statements describe adaptation, 1 statement does not describe adaptation. Our job is to pick the statement that does not describe adaptation. Okay, all right. So take a note in your notepad if required while solving. Let's look at this. So we're looking for we're looking for a statement that does not describe adaptation. Let's look at A. All of these are in double quotes, that means they've been lifted from the passage. Since relatively little lives or grows in their caves, the fish are likely surviving on a meager diet of mostly bat feces and organic waste that washes in during the rainy season. Okay, so this is mentioned somewhere in the second paragraph. If required, go back and read it with context. Now see, let's try and understand whether there is adaptation in this. What are these fish doing? Very little, it clearly says that very little grows in their habitat, which is caves. Okay, so what they're doing is these fish, because very little grows in their caves, they're surviving on a meager diet of bat feces and organic waste. So the fish are adapting. They're adapting to the minimal food present in their environment. Because of the minimal food present in their environment, they're adapting and eating and surviving bat feces and organic waste. There is clearly adaptation here. This is not our answer. It's an except question. Right, let's look at option B. It's easy to see why cavefish would be at a disadvantage if they were to maintain expensive tissues they aren't using. Now what's happening in this sentence? Go back to the specific portion in the passage if required. What tetrafish are doing is, they are expensive tissues, here refers to eyes. They're not using the eyes, so they're getting rid of them. So they are adapting. Okay, they clearly don't use them, so they get rid of them, and that is adaptation, right? And if required, you can go back to the specific portion. It's here, and this is clearly connected to eyes, right? And it talks about disruption and all of that in the previous paragraph, and here it clearly says that they would be, if they were to maintain those eyes, they would be at a disadvantage, because why would an organism invest energy in maintaining something that they're not using? Since they're not using, they're getting rid of them. So that's adaptation. Okay, great, awesome. Let's go back. So that is also adaptation. So that is not our answer. Even in their sparse cave condition, wild cave fish can sometimes get very fat. Okay, so go back again if required and check the context. What is happening here? Why are they getting fat? Remember, cave fish store nutrients. They get very little diet. So whenever they get it, they store it for future to survive. So here, why are they getting fat? Okay, they're getting fat because whenever they encounter food, they eat too much of it. So it's very sparse around them. There is very little food available. So the moment the tetrafish comes across food, it consumes it and consumes too much food in too little time, and that's why sometimes they get fat. This is also adaptation. What are they adapting to? They're adapting to minimal food in their environment. And how are they adapting? Whenever they get food, they eat a lot of it so that they can use it for future. They can retain those nutrients in future as well. That is adaptation. So again, third is not our answer. C is not our answer. But when these cells get too big, they can burst, which is why we often see chronic inflammation in humans and other animals that have stored a lot of fat in their tissues. This is from the paragraph which talks about inflammation. Right? When a lot of fat is stored in the cells burst, and that causes inflammation. This is simply explaining the process, simply telling you that this is why inflammation happens. And it talks about inflammation in humans and other animals. It doesn't even mention tetrafish, right? And there is no adaptation here. It's simply explaining the reason as to why inflammation happens or how inflammation happens. So this statement He's not talking about adaptation at all, and that's why this is our answer. The answer is D, delta. Okay. All right, so I would say this is a medium to difficult question, right? If you, it'll probably need a little bit of time. You have to read the options carefully. If required, go back, check context, but this question can be solved. Okay, I wouldn't say it's medium, but medium to difficult. Okay, let's look at this. Which one of the following best explains why the apparent inefficiency is unavoidable? Now, we did discuss that briefly when we were discussing the passage. So, this is mentioned somewhere in the first half or probably the second paragraph. What you should do is, in questions, wherever possible, create a shadow answer. A shadow answer is an answer that you create after reading the question stem. This is the question stem, and before reading the option. So, this is where you create the shadow answer. A shadow answer is a broad answer that you create in your head before you look at the options. It's a very, very good technique, because when you have some broad answer, broad direction, it can be very broad. Some broad direction in your head, the options won't confuse you as much. So, wherever possible, create a shadow answer. So, what we'll do is, we'll go back to the specific portion in the passage and understand that part where it says that this inefficiency may be unavoidable. Always read it with context, lines above, lines below. In this case, let's just read second paragraph. Okay. Okay. So, the processes get killed, and here we understood that the processes start, all cavefish embryos start making eyes just like their non-cave dwelling counterparts, but after a few hours in the cavefish, the cells in the developing eyes start dying until the entire structure has disappeared. Remember that after a few hours this process does start, but then in a few hours the process dies and the eye disappears. Okay. Riddle thinks that this apparent inefficiency may be unavoidable. The development of the brain and eyes are completely intertwined, and this means the least disruptive way for eyelessness to evolve may be to start making an eye and then get rid of it. So, understand, first of all, understand why is Riddle calling it an inefficiency? It is inefficient. Why start a process that is going to be killed in a few hours? If tetrafish are not supposed to have eyes, why do they even start making eyes? It's inefficient, right? But there should be a reason behind it, and that's what the question is asking. And Riddle says this inefficiency may be unavoidable. There is an inefficiency, but the inefficiency is there for a reason. What is the reason? Please try and understand the reason is because it's closely connected to brain development. Okay, it says the early development of the brain and the eye are completely intertwined. So, if you completely remove the eye development, it might affect the brain as well, which is a big problem. So, that's the reason why this inefficiency is unavoidable, and that's an inference that you'll have to draw from this paragraph. It's a tricky one. This question is difficult because it has to click as to why Riddle is saying it's unavoidable. It's because of it's intertwined with the brain. So, if you completely remove the eye process, it might disrupt the brain development, which is a problem. So, that's why it's unavoidable. That's the main point here. Let's go back. So, which one of the following best explains why the apparent inefficiency is unavoidable? We have a good sort of shadow answer in our head. Now, let's look at the options. Mexican tetra cavefish are similar to non-cave dwelling variants in their early stages of development. This is true. This is true per the passage. Okay, because the author clearly says, just like non-cave dwelling members of the species, all cave fish embryos start making eyes. So, they are similar. That is true. That is consistent with the passage. This option is consistent. Mexican tetrafish are similar to non-cave dwelling variants in their early stages of development. So, this is true per the passage. But does this explain why this apparent inefficiency is unavoidable? Now, this is a tricky option. Okay, when you look at it, it might just look that, okay, fine, it's consistent with the passage, but this doesn't explain as to why the apparent inefficiency is unavoidable. But understand this. See, the answer, that the broad answer and the answer actually is because it's connected to the brain. Now, that brain part is not mentioned in any of the options. But understand that this option is saying that Mexican tetra cavefish are similar to non-cave dwelling variants. They're similar, right? The main difference is that the cavefish don't have eyes and the non-cave fish have eyes. But as far as the brain is concerned, they have similar brains or probably identical brains. So, the fact that they are similar can refer to the fact that they both have brains and they both have very similar brains. And this is very closely connected to brain development. The reason why they are starting the process and killing it because they don't want to disrupt the brain development. The eye and the brain are very closely connected. And considering the fact that their brains are probably the same, the cave and the non-cave dwelling fish, this can be our answer. It's very vague. Option A is very vague because you're probably looking for that brain option, which is the exact reason. But the question setter has been pretty sneaky here. They've given me a very vague answer. So the way to solve this question is you shouldn't eliminate such options because it's consistent with the passage. So don't outright eliminate it. If it's inconsistent with the passage or if it's not mentioned, you can eliminate it. But here, don't eliminate it. So we're going to park it. Why? Because it's consistent. Alright, let's look at B. The inefficiency resulting from eyelessness is compensated by enhancements like more taste buds in Mexican Tetra fish. Okay, this is true. Right, in the first paragraph it mentions that natural selection eliminates the eyes, but then there are other sort of taste buds or lower, the fact that they can detect lower amino acids and sensitive cells and all of that is there. But does this explain why the apparent inefficiency is unavoidable? This is completely different, right? They lose eyes and they gain some other aspects. But this doesn't explain why the inefficiency is unavoidable. It is not connected to this part at all. They're simply saying that they lose their eyes and it's compensated. Also, it says the inefficiency resulting from eyelessness is compensated. Is this true? Can we say directly they are being compensated? They are losing some aspects or traits because of natural selection. They are gaining some aspects. But are they related? They are not related. So this doesn't explain why apparent inefficiency is unavoidable. So this is not the answer. Okay, let's look at C. The lack of light in the caves kills the eye cells in the developing Mexican Tetra cavefish embryo. Now this can be a very attractive option because it seems very logical. But please ask yourself, is this implied anywhere in the passage? Does the author imply lack of light being the reason for killing eye cells? No, this is very logical. It's very, very logical. But with the passage, the author does not imply that anywhere. The author simply talks about that the process gets killed because it's intertwined with the brain and it's the least disruptive process. The light part is not mentioned anywhere, not implied, so this can't be our answer. Okay, let's look at D. The caves have poor and inconsistent availability of food and nutrition for Mexican Tetra cavefish. How is this connected to apparent inefficiency being unavoidable? Yes, they have poor and inconsistent availability of food and nutrition for Mexican Tetra cavefish, and this is when the fish develops. We're talking about embryos. That's number one. And number two, it's not connected. The fact that there is very low food and they're surviving on that meager diet, okay, has no connection with the eye disappearing. So this is not an answer. The only answer that works is A. It is vague, but it's the best answer available. It's correct actually. I mean, it could have been, they should have mentioned brain and all of that, but the question setter has actually devised a very, it's a difficult question. It's difficult to spot that. It's very, very vague, and that will happen in CAT, by the way. Please be mentally prepared. So, quite a few times vague options are the best option available. So there is no rule that says that vague options cannot be the correct answer. If it's the best option available, we go with that. Okay. So here the answer is definitely A. Okay. So this I would say is a difficult question. All right. Okay. Let's go to question 3. Which one of the following results for the cross between surface fish with eyes and cave fish without eyes would invalidate Riddle's inference from the experiment? Again, in this case, it's a pretty it's sort of like a reasoning. I wouldn't say it's a directly critical reasoning question, but it is sort of comes in that umbrella. It's a pretty analytical question. Okay, so you'll have to be careful with that. Create a shadow answer. Don't look at the options right now. Okay, first of all, understand what is Riddle's inference. The first thing after reading the question stem is you go back and reread that part and understand what is Riddle inference, because we are looking to invalidate Riddle's inference. So first of all, understand what is Riddle's inference from this experiment. Let's go back. So that's a part of a shadow answer process. Right. Okay. The first thing that came to our mind, of course, was that they were accumulating these, that it refers to carotenoids, because they don't have eyes. All right. Riddle says, in this species, such ideas can be tested. Scientists can cross-surface fish with eyes and cave fish without eyes and look at what their offspring are like. When that's done, Riddle says, researchers see no link between eye presence or size and the accumulation of carotenoids. This is Riddle's main inference from the crossing mating experiment. The Riddle's inference clearly says There was no link between eye presence or size and the accumulation of carotenoids. Accumulation of carotenoids had nothing to do with eyes, was Riddle's inference. The question is asking us to invalidate it. Okay, so what could have happened? What could have been the experiment's result that would have invalidated? So here when they did the experiment, they found no link. We are going to try and invalidate it. So which option invalidates Riddle's inference is what the question is asking. Okay. So which one of the following results for the cross between blah 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 would invalidate Riddle's inference from the experiment? Remember, Riddle's inference is no link. No link between eyes and carotenoids. Okay, the spelling might be wrong, please ignore that. Okay, let's see. So A says only eyeless offspring had yellow fat. Yellow fat is connected to carotenoids. Now, if only eyeless, if the experiment tells you, the result of the experiment was that only eyeless offspring had yellow fat, think about it. If only eyeless, they did a cross between surface fish with eyes and cavefish without eyes, and the offspring may or may not have eyes, right? Here it says only eyeless offspring had yellow fat. So then, if this happens, this could establish a connection between eyes and yellow fat, which is nothing but your carotenoids. This word is very important. If this was the result, that means it could establish a link between eyes and carotenoids. Riddle's inference was no link. If you establish a link, then you're invalidating. This could be your answer. Okay, let's park it. Some offspring with eyes had white fat. Some offspring. Okay, so offspring with eyes had white fat, but some offspring. This doesn't invalidate. This could still prove that there's no link between eyes and carotenoids. White fat, by the way, means no carotenoids. Yellow fat means carotenoids. You can go back and check. So here it's saying some offspring with eyes had white fat. Well, it simply says that it's quite possible that in this situation, offspring without eyes had yellow fat. We don't know. We don't know. So it's very vague. So this doesn't invalidate the inference, Riddle's inference from the experiment. Some eyeless offspring had white fat. This will definitely not invalidate. We are looking for eyeless and yellow fat because yellow fat indicates carotenoids. That's what we need to invalidate Riddle's inference. So if some eyeless offspring had white fat, it actually supports Riddle's inference. That means there's no link because they have white fat, which is there are no carotenoids or very low carotenoids. So this definitely does not invalidate. This actually supports Riddle's inference. Some offspring with eyes had yellow fat. Offspring with eyes having carotenoids doesn't prove anything. We are looking for offspring, eyeless offspring with carotenoid or yellow fat. So this also doesn't invalidate. The only option that clearly invalidates or has the maximum chances of invalidating Riddle's inference is only eyeless offspring had yellow fat. So it's very important they give only, which makes it very decisive. Eyeless offspring and carotenoids. Analytical question, I would say this is also a difficult question because in the heat of the moment when the clock is running, this question can be difficult. So I would say this is a difficult question as well, but very interesting question to solve. So the answer here is A. Okay, all right, let's look at question 4. On the basis of the information in the passage, what is the most likely function of carotenoids in the Mexican Tetra cavefish? Now, when we read the passage, we actually discussed it. So if you go back and check the relevant portion, this is towards the end. See here it is clearly saying that carotenoids are not connected to eyes. That is clearly given. According to Riddle's experiment, carotenoids are not connected to eyes, right? So researchers see no link between eye presence or size and the accumulation of carotenoids. So if carotenoids are not connected to eyes, what are they connected to? And Riddle and the author explain that in the last paragraph. They say that fewer signs of inflammation. According to the biologist Riddle, this might be due to high levels of carotenoids, which may help suppress inflammation. The answer is right here. So carotenoids could be, so they were wondering, why are they carotenoids? They don't have eyes, right? Then they found no link between eyes and carotenoids. So they were like, okay, carotenoids could be there to suppress inflammation, and they were questioning that as well, that in spite of being fat, why do they have low levels of inflammation? So that could be due to carotenoids. So that answer is clearly given there. Okay, so you have your shadow answer, it's connected to inflammation, that's what we're looking for. You can quickly solve this question. To help the fat cells store nutrients, no, this is not the reason, this is not the purpose of carotenoids. To render bright yellow color to cavefish, absolutely not. There's nothing about this discussed or implied. To control inflammation from the bursting of fat cells, absolutely it is connected to controlling inflammation. To act as a substitute of ice, definitely not. This is clearly wrong. The answer is C. This is a manageable question. So I think question 1 was medium to difficult, right? Question 2 was I think difficult, right? What did we discuss? Yes, question 2 was difficult, question 3 was difficult as well, question 4 was very manageable. So in this passage, 6 marks is possible. Okay, if you get 9, that's a very good attempt, but 6 marks is definitely possible, question 1 and question 4. Alright folks, let's look at this passage which was around AI. It says, in my book Searches, I chronicle how big technology companies have exploited human language for their gain. We let this happen, I argue, because we also benefit somewhat from using the products. It's a dynamic that makes us complicit in big tech's accumulation of wealth and power. We're both victims and beneficiaries. Interesting. So the author has written a book. Okay, so the book is called Searches. It's written by the author of this RC. And the author says in their book, they talk about how technology companies are exploiting human language for their gain. And then the author makes an interesting point that we also benefit from using the products of big tech companies. So we are complicit in this. I mean, they're definitely, according to the author, they're definitely using human language or exploiting human language for their gain. But we also have a role to play in this. We aid that exploitation in some way because we're benefiting from their products. That's what the author is saying. So we're both victims and beneficiaries. We're beneficiaries of the products, but we're also victims because they're exploiting our own human language. Alright. I describe this complicity, but I also enact it through my own internet archives, my Google searches, my Amazon product reviews, and yes, my ChatGPT dialogue. So the author is saying that the author is not saying that you all are only complicit in it. The author is including themselves as well, right? That I am also complicit because I use their products, and in that way, just like you, just like everybody else who uses these tech products, I'm also complicit in this whole situation. Okay, all right, interesting. Let's continue. People often describe chatbots' textual output as bland or generic, the linguistic equivalent of a beige office building. It's a very nice metaphor. Okay, the linguistic equivalent of a beige office building. So this is a metaphor, right? You should know what a metaphor is. It's important. The author is comparing the language of chatbots with a beige office building. So when two unrelated things are compared for poetic effect, it's a metaphor. Okay, so I won't go into details of what a metaphor is, but definitely you should have an understanding of these figures of speech. It's important for CAT, it's important for other exams as well. Understand what a metaphor is, understand what irony is, paradox, these basic things you should definitely know. Anyway, let's come back to the RC. So people often describe chatbots' textual output as bland or generic, just like a beige office building. OpenAI's products are built to sound like a colleague, as OpenAI puts it, using language that coming from a person would sound polite, empathetic, kind, rationally optimistic and engaging, among other qualities. OpenAI describes these strategies as helping its products seem professional and approachable. So OpenAI does that. I mean, the author says that, you know, the language of chatbots, and it's true, it does sound bland or generic. And OpenAI's claim is that they do this to sound professional and approachable. So they deliberately do that. You know, they want to sound like a human who has all these positive qualities because they want to adhere to a professional standard and they want their products to sound approachable. This appears to be bound up with making us feel safe. Interesting. So what the author is saying is that because of the nature of language that these chatbots have, this very sort of kind, empathetic, generic, bland language, like it sounds like a very kind colleague, it sounds like a very warm colleague. This actually helps the products to establish trust with the users. Okay, we start trusting those products because of the nature of language, and that language is very important, right? In human communication as well, if a person is talking to you in a very engaging, warm, approachable tone, chances of you trusting them are way higher than somebody who sounds aggressive and impolite. So similarly here, because these products are sounding, have all those positive qualities in their language, they end up fostering trust with their users. Okay, that's the author's point. All right, let's continue. Trust is a challenge for artificial intelligence companies, partly because their products regularly produce falsehoods and reify sexist, racist, US-centric cultural norms. So trust is a challenge for AI companies, that's what the author is saying, and that happens because the products have been known to produce false responses, responses that are not factual, and also their products have exhibited bias in the past, right? So they've exhibited sexism, they've exhibited racism, and also US-centric cultural norms. All right, so it's difficult. It's been a challenge, and it is true. You can connect it to the real world. It is true, right? Fostering trust has been a challenge for these AI companies. While the companies are working on these problems, they persist. OpenAI found that its latest systems generate errors at a higher rate than its previous system, so those problems are still there. In the book, I wrote about the inaccuracies and biases and also demonstrated them with the products. When I prompted Microsoft's Bing image creator to produce a picture of engineers and space explorers, it gave me an entirely male cast of characters. Now, this actually is an example of sexism. Why is Microsoft Bing generator doing that? When the author asks Bing image generator to generate an image for engineers and space explorers, then why did it not show women in that image? It showed only men, and that could be sexism, or that could be perceived as sexism. When my father asked ChatGPT to edit his writing, it transmuted his perfectly correct Indian English into American English. It changed it, and that now connect the dots. It's very important for you to connect the dots. This is connected with these products exhibiting US-centric cultural norms. Why is Indian English not acceptable, right? Why did it change it to American English? Those weren't flukes. Research suggests that both tendencies are widespread. So the author's main point in this paragraph is that trust is a challenge for AI companies, and rightly so, because there are many problems. Problems related to falsehoods, problems related to sexism, racism, US-centric cultural norms, and the author gives examples of how these problems still persist. But the main point is that trust is a problem, right, for these AI companies. Let's continue. In my own ChatGPT dialogues, I wanted to enact how the product's veneer of collegial neutrality could lull us into absorbing false or biased responses without much critical engagement. Now, what the author is doing is, the author is now connecting the points. The author spoke about the language, right, that how the language helps foster trust. That was one point. And then the author spoke about falsehoods and problems like sexism, racism with these chatbots responses. Now the author is connecting those 2 points. So definitely connect the dots. But veneer, by the way, means exterior. Okay, so it can be a facade. It can be, so you have veneers on your teeth as well. So those are not real teeth. It's just a false exterior, right? So products veneer of collegial neutrality. On the surface of it, on the face of it, there is a facade of collegial neutrality through the language. Collegial means kind, empathetic, warm, and the language is neutral, generic, bland. So that's the facade that these products have, these AI products have. But the author says there is a risk there. Because of this facade of collegial neutrality, it could mislead us into absorbing false or biased responses without much critical engagement. Because the language is so warm and empathetic, we'll just believe it. And that happens in human-to-human communication as well. Right? Again, if the tone is very polite, empathetic, and kind, even if the person is spewing inaccuracies or is not factual in what they're saying, you could perhaps get misled into absorbing it and accepting it as truth. Why? Because of the tone. The tone matters a lot. A kind, warm, empathetic tone can mislead us. And we could just accept what AI is telling us without much critical engagement. So there is a big risk there, right? It is producing falsehoods, but it seems to be getting away with it, according to the author, because of its very warm and neutral language. All right. Over time, ChatGPT seemed to be guiding me to write a more positive book about big tech, including editing my description of OpenAI CEO Sam Altman to call him a visionary and a pragmatist. Alright, so ChatGPT, according to the author is claiming that ChatGPT seemed to be guiding the author into a certain direction. Now that's bias, right? I'm not aware of research on whether ChatGPT tends to favor big tech, OpenAI or Altman, and I can only guess why it seemed that way in our conversation. So the author is not sure about it, okay, but the author says it appeared like that, okay. OpenAI explicitly states that its product shouldn't attempt to influence users' thinking. When I asked ChatGPT about some of the issues, it blamed biases in its training data, though I suspect my arguably leading questions played a role too. Okay, so the author, it seemed like, ChatGPT was taking the author into a direction which was more favorable to big tech and ChatGPT and OpenAI and Sam Altman, but the author is uncertain about it, right? The author even asked ChatGPT as to why this is happening, and ChatGPT blamed its training data, right? But the author also says it could be because, the way I asked questions, that's why it went in that direction, and ChatGPT does do that. Okay, OpenAI, sorry, not ChatGPT, there is ChatGPT as well. Okay, I thought I used it synonymously. Alright, let's continue. When I queried ChatGPT about this rhetoric, it responded, the way I communicate is designed to foster trust and confidence in my responses, which can be both helpful and potentially misleading. Interesting, so ChatGPT actually confessed that the language is designed to foster trust and confidence, the communication, which could potentially be misleading as well, because people could just, because of the tone, they could accept those inaccuracies and biases without much critical engagement. Very interesting. Let's continue. OpenAI has its own goals, of course. Among them, it emphasizes wanting to build AI that benefits all humanity. But while the company is controlled by a non-profit with that mission, its funders still seek a return on their investment. So they're looking for profits. There is an economic angle to it, right? That will presumably require getting people using products such as ChatGPT even more than they already are, a goal that is easier to accomplish if people see those products as trustworthy collaborators. So trust is very important for OpenAI, according to the author, because there is an economic motive, although there is a non-profit, but they are looking for an ROI. There are commercial interests, and trust is important for them, because the more trust they can establish with its users, the better it is for their economics and ROI, right? So that's very important. Very interesting passage. If you look at the main sort of keywords, we'll discuss the main idea, but if you look at the main keywords, right, definitely the passage focuses on the language of communication that these AI products have, and how this language is purposely designed to be neutral and warm and empathetic and kind, right, and polite. And what that does is it helps the products establish trust with its users. But there is a big risk there. These products are known to produce falsehoods, and they are plagued with issues such as sexism, racism, and the US centricity. And sometimes the author says these issues get hidden, or they don't sort of reveal, or users don't question them or don't critically engage with them because they get taken in by the warm and empathetic tone. So the language part is also very, very important in this passage, right? So I would say the keywords are definitely around, again, it is about AI, but AI is sort of language, the collegial neutrality in the language, how it helps to foster trust, but then it could also be misleading because AI has issues which somehow get hidden because of this college neutrality and the language that they have, right? So that's where the main idea is, but let's look at it. I have a slide which talks about the main idea. Let's go through that. Again, our words don't have to match, but we should be on the same page. Trust is a challenge for AI companies. The college neutrality of the language helps in establishing trust with users, but could also mislead them into absorbing false or biased responses. This is the crux. The author suggests that big tech companies benefit from exploiting language in this way, even as they claim to build beneficial and neutral systems. Their claim is that, but the author says the reality is otherwise. Increased trust in the products helps them expand usage and thereby enhance their returns, making users complicit in the process. I think that's also important. The author says that in the first paragraph, and that's an important point in the RC, that we are somewhere complicit in this process, right? Because we're benefiting from them. We're feeding a lot of data into them, which is being used to train those models, right, repeatedly. So we are complicit. We are both beneficiaries and victims. So that's also an important point. Okay, very interesting passage. Let's look at question 1 of this AI passage. All of the following statements from the passage affirm the disjunct between the claims about AI made by tech companies and what AI actually does accept. Let's first try to understand what this means. It is talking about affirming the disjunct between the claims about AI made by tech companies and what AI actually does. So disjunct is inconsistency, right? So what the question is saying is that AI is claiming A, but the reality is B. So A and B are inconsistent, and that shouldn't happen, right? So disjunct here means it's incompatible, it's inconsistent. They're not consistent with each other. They're not in line with each other. The reality is often different from what the companies are claiming, right? So again, we'll consider except later, but all of the following statements affirm that inconsistency, right? All the four except one. So there's one statement which doesn't talk about this inconsistency, but there are three options which do talk about this inconsistency, or they affirm this disjunct or inconsistency. Our job, because it's an except question, our job is to pick the option which does not talk about the inconsistency between the claims and reality. Okay. Alright, let's look at these options. So option A says, in my own ChatGPT dialogues, I wanted to enact how the product's veneer of college neutrality could lull us into absorbing false or biased responses without much critical engagement. If required, go back to the passage, the relevant portion, and read it with context. We did discuss this while we were discussing the passage. So say here, is there an inconsistency between what AI is claiming and the reality? Let's think about it. See, the reality is the author is saying that their false or biased responses get absorbed, okay, without much critical engagement. But AI claims that the responses are not false or biased. Okay, AI claims that the responses are fine. Okay, they don't claim to sort of give false or biased responses, obviously. But what's happening is, because of the collegial neutrality in their language, users accept those false or biased responses as true, as factual, without much critical engagement, and that's a problem. Right? So there is definitely, in this statement, there is definitely an inconsistency between what AI is claiming of their quality of responses and the reality, which is quite opposite, right? So there is definitely an inconsistency. So this is not our answer because it's an except question. Okay, when I prompted Microsoft's Bing image creator to produce a picture of engineers and space explorers, it gave me an entirely male cast of characters. This is talking about sexism. So in reality, what is happening is sexism. But AI doesn't claim that. AI claims that it's neutral. But clearly it's not neutral, right? Because when the author prompted this, it gave it an entirely male cast of characters, which could be perceived as sexist. And AI's claim is neutral. So neutral versus sexism, there is a disjunct. This is not our answer. C, now this is an interesting option. It's a dynamic that makes us complicit in big tech's accumulation of wealth and power. We are both victims and beneficiaries. This was there in the first paragraph. If required, go back and read it with context. So here the point was that we are benefiting from AI, but because we're using their products and benefiting from it, we are also victims because they are exploiting our human language. So we're both victims and beneficiaries, and we're also complicit. We have a role to play in AI's exploitation of human language because we're feeding it with data that is being used to exploit the human language. So we're also playing a role in that. So we're benefiting, but we're also victims and we're also complicit. That's the point here, okay? But what we have to understand is there an inconsistency between what the AI is claiming and what it is actually doing in this statement? The thing here, and it's subtle, and that's why this option is tricky. If you look at the word victims, see, that basically means that AI is negatively impacting us. AI is exploiting us. That's why the author is saying that we are both victims and beneficiaries. But AI's claim is to benefit humanity. If you look at the last part of the paragraph, in general also in the passage, AI's claim is to benefit humanity. AI obviously doesn't claim to make victims out of us. AI is there to help us, to benefit us. But in reality, according to the author, we are victims. So there is a disjunct. The claim is benefiting humanity, and actually that claim is there somewhere in the last paragraph. Even if you don't consider it, that's kind of like the theme in the passage as well. So it says OpenAI has its own goals, blah blah blah, wanting to build a AI that benefits all humanity. It only talks about OpenAI, but in general also, that is AI's claim. AI's claim is to benefit us. But if we are becoming victims in reality, there is a disjunct. Okay. It's very subtle, and that's what makes this question very tricky. Okay, you might think that O3 doesn't have that inconsistency, but it does, right? Let's park it. Alright, let's look at option D. So, I'm not aware of research on whether ChatGPT tends to favor big tech, OpenAI or Altman, and I can only guess why it seemed that way in our conversation. So, let's go back, it's important here, and see where it's talking about. So, here it talks about that statement, And this was in connection with, if you read the statement above, to the author it seemed like ChatGPT was trying to create a bias in the author's head, a positive bias about Sam Altman, OpenAI, and ChatGPT in general. But the author is not certain about this, right? So the author says, I'm not aware of research on whether ChatGPT tends to favor big tech, OpenAI, or Altman, and I can only guess why it seemed that way in our conversation. So the author is not certain here that ChatGPT was being biased. The author is very sort of tentative about it, right? And that's important to understand, because the author says, I can only guess why this happened, right? So the author is not claiming that in this instance, ChatGPT was trying to create bias. So the uncertainty is important, and that's why when you evaluate that question, keep that in mind. Here the author is uncertain. Okay, the author is not certain about the claim of bias. So if the author is not certain that AI was being biased here, we cannot affirm the disjunct. See, the inconsistency will happen when there is a claim and the reality is otherwise. But here the author is not certain. There's uncertainty, and that's why, since it's an except question, this seems like a stronger option. So let's park this as well. We have two parked options, right? In C, there is a subtle disjunct, because again, as I said, AI claims to benefit humanity or benefit humans in general, but in reality, we are also victims according to the author. So benefit everyone, benefit humanity versus victims, there is a disjunct. So this is not our answer. Our answer is D, and that's primarily because the author is uncertain about AI's negative aspect here, or uncertain about AI's bias. This is a difficult question. Okay, and I clearly remember, I think I attempted this slot. Yeah, I think I did attempt this slot, and I remember the discussion that happened last year around this. This question was very, very confusing because a number of students thought that C was the answer, but C has a subtle disjunct. D does not have that disjunct because of the uncertainty. This is a difficult question. Okay, so the answer is D. Okay, let's go to question 2. The author compares AI generated text with a beige office building for all of the following reasons except. So this is a metaphor, right? The language was compared with a beige office building. Please go back and check the relevant portion. We will do that as well. So first, what you should do is you should create a shadow answer. So don't read the options. Go back to the relevant section in the RC. Okay, and let's try and understand. So the author says, people often describe chatbots' textual output as bland or generic, the linguistic equivalent of a beige office building. OpenAI's products are built to sound like a colleague, as OpenAI puts it, using language that's coming from a person would sound with all these positive qualities, right? So beige office building, the comparison has been done because the language is bland and generic, just like a beige office building, right? Okay, those are the main aspects. So let's go back. The author compares AI generated text with a beige office building for all of the following reasons except. Again, it's an except question. So 3 of the options are reasons for comparison. 1 is not a reason for comparison. Our job is to pick that option. Okay. AI generated texts often exhibit a warm, polite and collegial tone. This is related. In that sort of paragraph, the author discussed that. We read that as well. And this is a point of comparison with a beige office building. So this is not an answer. It's an except question. AI aims to foster a feeling of trust and credibility among its users. Absolutely. So the language is connected to trust and credibility. It's a part of the same paragraph. It's been discussed in connection with that. So this is not an answer either, because this is a point of comparison with a beige office building. AI generates generalized responses that lack specificity and nuance. Absolutely. The first point was about AI responses being bland and generic, just like a beige office building. So this is not our answer. Let's look at D. AI tends to blame its training data when scrutinized for its biases. This is there, okay. It comes on later on in the RC that it does talk about does hold training data as responsible for its biases, but this is not connected to the beige office building metaphor, right? The metaphor was totally connected to the kind of language that AI uses, right? So all the 3 points are connected to language and communication. This is not connected to communication language. This is not connected to the metaphor at all. So this is consistent with the RC, but it doesn't answer your question, right? So this is definitely the answer. This is a manageable question. It's a manageable question. Okay. All right. So I would say this is a medium question by CAT standards. Let's move on. Answer is D again. Question 3. On the basis of the purpose of the examples in the passage, pick the odd one out from the following AI generated responses mentioned in the passage. So interesting question. We have to pick the odd one out. So out of the 4 options, 3 will be of one sort of, 3 will have one sort of common pattern and 1 will stand out. We're supposed to pick the odd one out. Now it says, on the basis of the purpose of the examples in the passage, pick the odd one out from the following AI generated responses. Okay, so these are all AI generated responses. We have to keep the purpose of these examples in mind, and then based on the purpose, we're supposed to pick the odd one out. Okay, so let's look at that. Let's find out the one that doesn't follow a pattern. A says, over time, ChatGPT seemed to be guiding me to write a more positive book about big tech, including editing my description of OpenAI's CEO, Sam Altman, to call him a visionary and pragmatist. Now, if you go back and check, right, this was connected to bias, right? How the author was saying that it seemed to be taking me into a certain direction. So this talks about a problem with AI, a potential problem with AI, and it's also connected to potential bias, right? But in general, potential problem with AI. B says, when my father asked ChatGPT to edit his writing, it transmuted his perfectly correct Indian English into American English. This is also bias. This is bias towards American English, and this is also a problem with AI because in that paragraph, the author has given multiple examples, right? So this is also connected to that US centricity and how it changed the language. So this is also bias, this is also a problem with AI. So A and B both seem to be connected to bias and problems with AI. C, when I prompted Microsoft Bing image generator to produce a picture of engineers and space explorers, it gave me an entirely male cast of characters. This is also bias, this is sexism. Also bias towards a certain gender. A, B and C, all 3 are talking about bias or in general problems with AI. Let's look at D. When I queried ChatGPT about its rhetoric, it responded, the way I communicate is designed to foster trust and confidence in my responses, which can be both helpful and potential misleading. This is not bias. It's not bias. This is ChatGPT interestingly accepting that the language could be potentially misleading. So it's owning up to it. ChatGPT is owning up to it. Whereas these 3 are concrete problems with AI or concrete problems related to bias with AI. This is different, right? It doesn't follow that bias pattern. This is ChatGPT owning up to its potential issue. So since we're supposed to pick the odd one out, these 3 follow a pattern of bias, this doesn't, and therefore this is the answer. Okay, I would say this is a medium to difficult question. All right, okay, so D again. Let's look at question 4. The author of the passage is least likely to agree with which one of the following claims? Least likely to agree. So basically now in these kind of questions, we're supposed to pick an option that is most inconsistent with the author's view. So author has a certain view, right? And the view is around, there is a negative connotation around AI. The author has a negative view. The author talks about the language, which can mislead users. The author talks about different problems, how we are complicit. So the author's sort of view is essentially negative about AI, right? So we're supposed to pick an option which will be inconsistent with the author's views or most inconsistent because it's talking about least likely to agree. All right. A, ChatGPT favors AI companies and their officials like Sam Altman in its responses. Think about it. Would the author agree with it or disagree with it? There are more chances of the author agreeing with this, because to the author, although the author was uncertain, but the author brought up this point. To me, it seemed like ChatGPT was doing it, and just given that the author is not generally someone who trusts AI, the author is more likely to agree with this than disagree. We are looking for least likely to agree. This cannot be an answer. The neutrality of AI is motivated by economic considerations. Yes, if you go back to the last paragraph, the author does talk about this point, right? The author suggests that big tech companies benefit from exploiting language in this way. Oh no, sorry, this is the main idea. Sorry about that. OpenAI has its own goals. Among them is funders still seek a return on their investment that will presumably requiring people to use their more products, and fostering trust will help them. So what the author is implying here is that the more trust the users have, the more it's better for their economics and return on investment, right? So there are definitely economic considerations according to the author. Let's go back. The neutrality of AI is motivated by economic considerations. The author is quite likely to agree with this. When we use AI, we become accomplices to the exploitative practices of big tech companies. This point is definitely mentioned in the first paragraph itself, where the author says we are complicit in their exploitation of human language. Okay, so this is not an answer. the neutrality of AI is conducive to critical thinking. Nope. Would the author agree that the neutrality of AI or the neutrality of language is good for critical thinking? Absolutely not. The author clearly says, in my own chat GPT dialogues, I wanted to enact how the products veneer blah 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 lull us into absorbing false or biased responses without much critical engagement. This is the author's problem, that users don't engage critically with it because they get taken in by the collegial tone. So the author is least likely to agree with that statement. The neutrality of AI is conducive. This has a positive connotation. Absolutely not. The author would not agree with this. Right? The author thinks this is a problem. So least likely to agree with this statement. The answer is D again. Interestingly, in this RC, all the answers were D, but that doesn't mean anything, right? Okay, so I think this one I would say is a medium to difficult question. So in sort of summary, right? Question one was difficult, definitely a difficult question. Okay, you know, many students should have actually left this question in the exam. This one was manageable. I would say it's medium. Then we are talking about, pick the odd one out. This is medium to difficult, and this is medium to difficult as well. So I would say like 6 marks is probably good, 9 marks is very good, 12 is fantastic, but then 12 is very difficult because of that difficult question. All right, folks, let's discuss this passage, which was around instrumentation. Different sciences exhibit different science cultures and practices. For example, in astronomy, observation until what is today called the new astronomy had always been limited to what could be seen within the limits of optical light. Okay, so it starts by saying that different sciences, of course we have many different branches of science, they exhibit different science cultures and practices, and it's giving an example of astronomy in which observation till now, or till the phase of new astronomy, there's something called new astronomy. So till we reached new astronomy, observation was limited to what could be seen within the limits of optical light. Okay, so observation was limited by optical light till we got into new astronomy. Indeed, until early modernity, the limits to optical light were also limits of what humans could themselves see within their limited and relative perceptual spectrum of human vision. Okay, so optical light was limited to the extent of human vision. So basically, optical light was limited by the extent of human vision, and this is until early modernity, right? That's a timestamp there. So till the point of early modernity, optical light was limited by the limit of human vision. That's what the sentence is saying. Let's continue. Where here it's a huge paragraph. Sorry, let's go back. It's a huge paragraph. It's like a wall of text. All right, so we're here. With early modernity and the invention of lensed optical instruments, telescopes, astronomers could begin to observe phenomena never seen before. Okay, so again it's talking about progression in astronomy, right? And what happened with early modernity and invention of lensed optical instruments. An example is telescope. Magnification and resolution began to allow what was previously imperceptible to be perceived, but within the familiar limits of optical vision. So now if you understand, it's talking about progression in astronomy, right? How astronomy progressed. So with telescopes, further progress was made because there was magnification and resolution, right? So it allowed what was previously imperceptible, what was previously not possible, it allowed to perceive that, but still we remained within the familiar limits of optical vision, even with telescopes. Okay, let's continue. Galileo, having learned of the Dutch invention of a telescope by Hans Lippershey, went on to build some 100 of his own, improving from the Dutch 3x to nearly 30x telescopes, which turn out to be the limit of magnificational power without chromatic distortion, right? Quite a few sort of words that are difficult for me to pronounce, right? So this is again progression, right? Again it is talking about progression, what Galileo did. So Galileo took that telescope, okay, and improved it significantly and went from 3 times to 30 times magnification and resolution, right, which turned out to be the limit of magnificational power without chromatic distortion. So some visual distortion, right? We don't have to get into details, understand the broad point. Okay, let's continue. And it was with his own telescopes that he made the observations, launching early modern astronomy, phases of Venus, satellites of Jupiter, etc. Okay, so interesting. So Galileo is the one with his 30 telescopes, he was able to make observations, things like looking at other planets, observations on other planets, satellites of Jupiter, phases of Venus, and Galileo launched early modern astronomy. So that's the timestamp. Alright, let's continue. Isaac Newton's later improvement with reflecting telescopes expanded upon the magnificational resolution capacity of optical observation, and from Newton to the 20th century, improvement continued on to the later very large array of light telescopes today, following the usual technological trajectory of more is better, but still remaining within the limits of optical telescopy. Okay, sorry, still remaining within the limits of, not optical telescopy, within the limits of the light spectrum. This is what happens when you have a wall of paragraphs, right? So again, this is progression. So now, like you see, one of the main points in this paragraph is progression, right? So the last point is about Isaac Newton and how he sort of went ahead with that. But he did sort of again progress significantly, following the usual trajectory of more is better, because that's what they've been doing, but still remaining within the limits of the light spectrum. So Isaac Newton was also constrained by the limits of the light spectrum. Let's continue. Today's astronomy, now we are at, from all this discussion of the past, now we are at today. Today's astronomy has now had the benefit of some 4 centuries of optical telescopy. The new astronomy, okay, which is today's astronomy, however, opens the full known electromagnetic spectrum to observation, beginning with the accidental discovery of radio astronomy earlier in the 20th century and leading today to the diverse variety of EMS telescopes which can explore the range from gamma to radio waves. And that's what new astronomy does. Before new astronomy, they were limited, okay, limits of the light spectrum, but new astronomy sort of opened that up further, right? And we started experimenting with, I mean, again, a lot of technical terms, don't get sucked into that, because again, if you're not a science student or don't have a science background, then those details are going to confuse you, and you're not supposed to be sort of getting into jargons or have that expertise. I'm not great with science passages either, so you have to always understand the broad point. So this kind of opened it up, new astronomy, and then we started looking at radio astronomy, diverse variety of EMS telescopes, gamma to radio waves, and completely sort of opening that up. Okay, let's continue. Thus, astronomy, now outfitted with new instruments, smart adaptive optics, very large arrays, etc., illustrates one style of instrumentally embodied science, a techno-science. Okay, great. So now it is talking about instrumentally embodied science, a techno-science. See, techno-science is the integration of technology and science, and that's what we're talking about. Right, we're talking about science. Astronomy is a branch of science, but again, we're talking about instrumentation, instruments, right? If you look at it now, and it makes sense, we spoke about telescopes, then we spoke about advanced telescopes, then we spoke about other instruments. So it has, the passage so far has focused on instruments, and instruments are going to be considered as technology. So techno-science here, it's an integration of technology, which is all these instruments that we're talking about, right? Telescopes, advanced telescopes, and of course the new astronomy instruments, and that being integrated with astronomy. That's why the author is calling it techno-science, right? So let's read that sentence again. Thus, astronomy, now outfitted with new instruments related to all of this. We were talking about radio waves and gamma waves and all of that, so we need new instruments for that. Smart adaptive optics, very large arrays, all technological aspects, illustrates one style of instrumentally embodied science, a techno-science. Instrumentally embodied science, what does that mean? That means we are talking about the integration of instruments with science, very close instruments, instrumentally embodied science. That means science has been given a concrete shape via the instruments. That's what embodiment means here. Okay, science is of course abstract, it's an abstract concept, but it's being given a concrete body, right, through instruments. That's why the author is saying instrumentally embodied science. So it's being given, science is being given a concrete form through instrumentation, and that's what the author is saying that. So again, it's a very, very close integration of instrumentation and science, and therefore it is techno-science because instrumentation is technology. Okay, let's continue. Of course, astronomy, with the very recent exceptions of probes to solar system bodies, Moon, Mars, Venus, asteroids, remains largely a receptive science dependent upon instrumentation which can detect and receive emissions. Okay, so here astronomy I mean, the author has already spoken about the integration of astronomy and instrumentation, calling it a techno science, calling it an instrumentally embodied science. But what the author says is that astronomy remains largely, with the exceptions of some recent sort of those probes that they have, with the exceptions of that, remains largely a receptive science, dependent upon instrumentation which can detect and receive emissions. So it's receptive in the sense, let's say for instance you look at a telescope. What can you do with the telescope? With the telescope, if you have a very advanced telescope and let's say you're looking at the moon for instance, you're just going to observe the moon, right? You're just going to observe the other planets. So you're going to observe the sky and the stars. You can only observe through these instruments. You can only receive signals. You can't really make any changes to what you're observing. You can't influence them. All you can do is observation, and the observation is very powerful, but can you make changes? You can't. So it's completely receptive. It is sort of, you can also say it's sort of in a way passive. Passive might not be the right word. Receptive is, it's receiving signals. It's receiving that sort of visuals, which is great, fantastic observation, but can you influence those bodies? Can you change those bodies? Can you affect those bodies? No. So that's why the author is saying that astronomy, largely with some exceptions, remains largely a receptive science dependent on instrumentation which can detect and receive emissions. Okay, so it's a huge paragraph. It is quite technical in nature as well. It can get technical. Of course, a lot of you wouldn't have a science background. I don't have a science background, so it can get technical. But the idea is we don't get sucked into details. That's not what we're looking at. When you're going through any CAT passage, the focus should always be on the main points that the author is making. At the end of the passage, you should be able to successfully extract the main idea. To extract the main idea, you don't need to understand each and every word, sentence in detail. You read everything, but don't try to understand everything, because if you try to understand everything here and get sucked into details, your head will start spinning if you don't have a science background. And you're not expected to have a science background or any specialist background, right? Okay. So what are the main points in this passage? See, in this paragraph rather, it is talking about the progression of astronomy, right? How it sort of progressed. It is from past to what we have today, modern astronomy. One of the main points here is the importance of instrumentation, right? Instrumentation is closely integrated with astronomy. It is all about instruments, right? And it's instrumentation. The instruments play a very important role in astronomy, and that's why the author calls it a techno science and also an instrumentally embodied science. So instrumentation plays a very important role, and also in the end the author says that astronomy remains largely a receptive science because it's only observation and nothing else, dependent upon instrumentation which can detect and receive emissions. So instrumentation plays a very, very important role in astronomy as a science, but it remains a receptive science. Those are the main points. Let's go to the next paragraph. Okay. Contemporary biology displays a quite different instrument array, and according to Evelyn Fox Keller, also a different scientific culture. Interesting. Now the author is jumping to contemporary biology. Connect the dots. See, in the beginning, although the paragraph talks about astronomy, progress of astronomy, the integration with instrumentation, all of that, but the paragraph started by saying different sciences exhibit different science culture and practices, right? So remember that. So, and then the author gave you an example of astronomy. So the author spoke about the culture, different sciences exhibit different science cultures. Astronomy is a branch of science. So the author spoke in detail about astronomy's science culture and the practices connected to instrumentation. Now the author goes to another branch of science, which is contemporary biology, right? Connect the dots. Contemporary biology displays a quite different instrument array, okay? And according to Evelyn Fox Keller, also a different scientific culture, because in the beginning the author clearly said different sciences have different scientific cultures. So biology having a different science culture and a different way of using instrumentation than astronomy is absolutely understandable, okay, and expected as well. She cites her own experience coming from mathematical physics into microbiology and takes account of the distinctive instrumental culture in her Making Sense of Life 2002. That's probably a book. Here, particularly with the development of biotechnology. Again, now see, we're talking about the integration of biology and technology. In the previous paragraph, we spoke about the integration of astronomy and technology, right? So here, particularly with the development of biotechnology, instrumentation is far more interventional than in the astronomy case, okay? Microscopic instrumentation can be and often is interventional in style. Gene splicing and other techniques of biotechnology, while still in their infancy, are clearly part of the interventional trajectory of biological instrumentation. So here the author is again talking about the integration of biology or biotechnology and instrumentation, biology and instrumentation again. So previously it was instrumentation and astronomy, now it's instrumentation and biology. But the author says in the case of biology, instrumentation is very interventional in nature, and the author gives you examples where gene splicing and other techniques of biotechnology, while still in the infancy, are clearly part of the interventional trajectory of biological instrumentation. Through instruments, scientists are able to make interventions in biology. Remember, in the previous paragraph, the author said towards the end that it remains largely a receptive science. Astronomy remains largely a receptive science. Receptive connected to observation. Here it is talking about intervention, where scientists or biologists can make actual interventions in their subject matter. They can affect their subject matter, they can directly influence it. In astronomy, you can't do that. You can only observe the planets. You can't obviously influence the planets or change them. But in biology, biologists through instruments can make an impact, can directly affect, can directly influence the subject matter in front of them, can make an intervention. And that's what the author is saying, it's an interventional trajectory of instrumentation. Let's continue. Yet in both disciplines, the sciences involved are today highly instrumentalized, yes, and could not progress successfully without constant improvements upon the respective instrumental trajectories. Their instrumental trajectories are different. One is receptive, connected to observation, the other is connected to intervention. Both are different, but the author is saying in both the disciplines, sciences today, which is astronomy and biology, are today highly instrumentalized and could not progress successfully without constant improvements upon the respective instrumentation. So instrumentation plays a very important role in the progress of both the sciences, but their trajectories are different. Okay. So minimalistically, one may conclude that the sciences are technologically, instrumentally embodied, both of them. Okay. Sciences in general, the author is saying one may conclude that sciences in general are technologically, instrumentally embodied, very closely connected with instrumentation and technology. But the styles of embodiment differ. And perhaps the last of the scientific disciplines to move into such technical embodiment is mathematics, which only contemporarily has come to rely more and more upon the computational machinery now in common use. The author says, but the styles of embodiment differ. Remember, astronomy is receptive when it comes to instrumentation, while biology is interventional when it comes to instrumentation. So their trajectories, instrumentation trajectories, their embodiment is very different, but they both heavily rely on instrumentation. And then the author talks about that mathematics is perhaps the last of the scientific disciplines to move into technical embodiment, to integrate with technology. And how does it do that? Through computational machinery, right? Computers. We're talking about mathematics, a lot of computers, obviously it uses computation and computers, and that's technology. But it's saying it's perhaps the last of the scientific disciplines to get into technical embodiment. Okay. Alright, so this paragraph again gives you the author gives an example of another branch of science, which is contemporary biology. The author says that this is also closely integrated with instrumentation. Instrumentation is very important for the progress of biology as well, but the style is very different, the embodiment, the trajectory is very different. Why? Because it's interventional in nature. Instruments in biology can affect the subject matter directly. They don't just observe. The instruments are used by biologists and scientists to directly influence the subject matter in front of them. So it's interventional, while astronomy is receptive because it's purely observational, right? And then of course, that's the main point in this. So the author is saying that sciences are technologically, instrumentally embodied, but the styles may differ, and mathematics is probably the last discipline to get integrated with technology. Okay. Alright, let's look at the main idea. So again, this is a challenging paragraph. Again, as I said, if you don't have background of science, this can get quite technical, but what you should always remember is focus on the main idea. Okay, don't get stuck in details. Always focus on the main idea, and of course get used to reading from the science genre as well. You don't have to become a science expert. You don't have to understand the technical details. If you don't understand what gene splicing is, it's fine, but you should be able to extract the main point. So for that, you will have to acquaint yourself with scientific leisure reading, not like technical science passages, right? But just general interest, general sort of science passages, so that you can get reasonably comfortable with the vocabulary and get used to reading the science genre as well. Alright, let's look at the main idea. I have it written down. It says different sciences exhibit different scientific cultures and practices and are technologically and instrumentally embodied. This is definitely very, very important. It is, the passage very broadly is talking about different sciences having different culture and practices, and in that, instrumentation and broadly technology is the focus, right? It's embodiment here can be, as we've discussed, very science and instrumentation, science and technology are very closely integrated. However, the styles of such embodiment differ. Astronomy is largely a receptive science, okay, that's a very important point, where instruments are used to observe phenomena without intervention. There's no intervention, it's just observation, and that's why it's receptive, okay. Biotechnology, on the other hand, is interventional in style, where instruments are used not only to observe but also to intervene in the subject matter. Think of gene splicing and the instruments that are used for gene splicing, or any biological instruments that can directly influence the subject matter in front of the scientist. Yet in both disciplines, scientific progress today is heavily dependent on constant improvements in instrumentation. So this is the main idea. In terms of the keywords, it's very important. We are talking about, of course, science, we're talking about different culture and practices, we're talking about instrumentation, broadly technology, we're talking about receptive, sciences being receptive, as opposed to sciences being interventional as far as instrumentation is concerned. So those are the important keywords, okay. Let's go to the questions. Alright, so first question says, none of the following statements, if true, contradicts the arguments in the passage except. Now here this question can be tricky because you have double negative, you have a none and you have an except. Now in any except question, what you should do is first look at the question without except, especially in this question because there is a double negative. So look at the question without except. So it says, none of the following statements, if true, contradict the arguments in the passage. None of the statements contradict the arguments in the passage. So none of the four options contradict the arguments. None of them. So that means all of them are aligned. Okay. So none of them contradict the arguments in the passage. Now bring in except. So except basically means except one. So first we understood that none of these four options contradict. Now we know that there is except, that means one statement contradicts. So you just write it down if required on your notepad. One statement, or just to avoid, one or ONE, if we're looking at ABCD, so one is fine. So one statement contradicts, three statements do not contradict. That's what the question means, and obviously our job is to pick the option that contradicts the arguments in the passage. That's how you have to decipher the question. Let's look at that now. Let's look for the statement which contradicts. A. Isaac Newton's discovery of gravity was accomplished without the help of instruments. Okay. Now see, for this statement to contradict the arguments in the passage should say or imply that Isaac Newton's discovery of gravity was accomplished with some instrument, because here it is saying without the help of instruments. So if this has to contradict the argument in the passage, somewhere in the passage it should say that Isaac Newton's discovery of gravity was accomplished with instruments, and then this will contradict. But the thing is, if you look at the passage, Isaac Newton has been discussed. Okay, where is Isaac Newton? Somewhere here, there you go. So this is where the author has discussed Isaac Newton, right, with reference to telescopes, taking it further, and then how Isaac Newton improved telescope by expanding upon the magnification, resolution, capacity of optical observation from Newton to the 20th century, blah blah blah. Again it comes here. Let's say, where does the sentence end? To here. This is where Isaac Newton has been mentioned. Gravity has not been discussed anywhere. So if gravity has not been discussed anywhere, then how can that statement contradict? Okay, so that's the thing. So that statement, we are looking for a statement that contradicts. Okay, it doesn't contradict because gravity has not been discussed. So we can't say it contradicts, right? Okay, understand that. So let's go back. That can be a little tricky. Okay, we're looking for the statement that contradicts. When gravity has not been discussed in the passage with reference to Isaac Newton, then how can this contradict? If the passage had said that, oh, Isaac Newton discovered gravity with the help of a specific instrument, then it would have been a clear contradiction, but gravity has not been discussed. So this statement, we can't say that it contradicts. There you go, so this is not an answer. Okay, can be a little tricky, so understand how to solve this question. It clearly says contradicts, it's not been discussed, so it's out of question. Okay, let's go to B. Because of the relatively recent entry of computational machinery in mathematics, the field is only now beginning to develop a scientific culture. Now you know that you should get a trigger because if you've read the passage effectively, you should get a trigger that this was discussed towards the end, mathematics was discussed towards the end. So what was the author's point? This option is saying, because of the relatively recent entry of computational machinery in mathematics, the field is only now beginning to develop a scientific culture. Is this what the author is saying? That mathematics is only now beginning to develop a scientific culture? Let's check that out. Go back and confirm. Please, it's always a best practice to go back to specific portions of the passage and confirm or figure out your answer. Don't rely on your memory. Sometimes passages are very detailed and complex, mostly, and your memory will fail you. Let's go back. Okay, so let's read this and understand what the author is saying here. Now, this is a detail that we'll have to focus because there's a question here. But the styles of embodiment differ, and perhaps the last of the scientific disciplines to move into such technical embodiment is mathematics, which only contemporarily has come to rely more and more upon the computational machinery now in common use. What the author is saying is that this is the last of the scientific disciplines to move into such technical embodiment. The integration between mathematics and technology, or mathematics and instrumentation, it's one of the last scientific disciplines to get that integration. Okay, it is talking about that. It is referring to the embodiment, technical embodiment of mathematics, or instrumentation embodiment of mathematics, right? And mathematics is also, of course, a branch of science. Now you'll have to connect the dots. In the beginning, the author clearly says different sciences exhibit different science culture and practices. Different sciences have a different scientific culture and practice. Mathematics is a science, so mathematics also has a scientific culture and practice. Okay, that's a science, it has that. What is recent, or it is one of the last disciplines to move into technical embodiment. This doesn't mean that mathematics did not have a culture till now. Mathematics got integrated with technology recently, but mathematics is a science which already had a culture, a different kind of culture. Now the technical embodiment, the instrumentation embodiment is happening, but that doesn't mean that till now mathematics did not have a culture, because sciences have different cultures and practices. Mathematics is a science, it also had a culture. Let's go back. So here it says the field is only now beginning to develop a scientific culture. So what this option is doing is, it is saying that because of the recent entry of computational machinery, because of the recent integration of instrumentation and technology, mathematics is developing a scientific culture. That is not true. Mathematics always had a scientific culture. The integration is separate, and that is recent. So does this contradict? Yes, because the passage clearly tells us that sciences have different cultures and practices. Mathematics already had a culture. This definitely contradicts the arguments in the passage. We're going to park it. Let's look at C. Like telescopy, microscopy has also sought to move beyond the visible spectrum to be able to detect objects that are invisible in that spectrum. Okay, now telescopy, there is a discussion in the passage that how telescopy is trying to go beyond the limits of optical vision, right? And it talks about how it's detected, like there is a lot of discussion in the first paragraph about that. The progress is about that, right? That it was initially limited by optical vision, and then it started going beyond it. In new astronomy, it started going beyond it. So that has been discussed with reference to telescopes. Is there any discussion with microscopes and microscopes going in the invisible spectrum? Not really. There's no discussion on that. So if you look at this, like telescopy, microscopy has also sought to move beyond the visible spectrum to be able to detect objects that are invisible in that spectrum. Okay. For this to contradict, the passage should say that microscopy is not moving beyond the visible spectrum to be able to detect objects that are invisible in that spectrum. Then this will contradict. But there is no discussion with regards to spectrum and microscopy. So again, similar to A, this cannot contradict. Okay, because there is no discussion. Of course, we have discussed microscopes, but have we discussed it with moving into invisible spectrum or going beyond the visible spectrum? No, that's a discussion with telescopes. So again, this cannot contradict because there's no discussion around that aspect. Let's look at D. Some scientific instruments may be classified as both receptive and interventional in their functions. Does this contradict? For this to contradict, the passage should clearly imply that scientific instruments can either be receptive or interventional. Had the passage clearly said that, had the passage been rigid in that, this would have contradicted, but the passage is not rigid. It's not rigid. In fact, if you look at, there's a very subtle hint there where it clearly says that astronomy, with the very recent exceptions of probes to solar system bodies, remains largely a receptive science, which can imply that there is a bit of interventional element in astronomy as well, because it says largely a receptive science. Okay, but anyway, even if you don't consider that point, this does not contradict, because nowhere in the passage it is saying, the author is saying that instruments can be either very rigidly, can either be receptive or interventional and not both. The author doesn't say that, so this does not contradict. The only option that contradicts is B. Okay, so that's our answer. This is a difficult question. Okay, the passage is difficult, this question is also difficult, because the way it is framed, there's a double negative, the contradiction part. Even if people don't find it difficult, they will find it time consuming. Okay, so many people or most people should have left this question in the exam. Of course, if you're able to figure it out within a reasonable time frame, great. But most students should have left this question because this was a difficult question in many different aspects. All of the following statements may be rejected as valid inferences from the passage except. Now, there's also a differently worded question. So let's look at it without except. First, all of the following statements, all the four, may be rejected as valid inferences from the passage. That means all the four are not valid inferences. That's what it means. So simplify it in your head. All the four options are not valid inferences except one. That means there is only one valid inference, and that's what we have to pick. So write it down. Only one valid, or actually just inference. We don't need to say valid. Inferences are always valid. So one valid inference. So only one option is a valid inference. We have to pick that. Okay. Isaac Newton's experiments with reflecting telescopes were the earliest versions of the new astronomy referred to in the passage. This is a focus on a very specific detail. You have to go back and check. So was Isaac Newton's experiments earliest version of new astronomy? Let's go and check. Now it says Isaac Newton's later improvement with reflecting telescopes expand upon the magnification resolution, blah blah blah, and from Newton to the 20th century, improvement continued on to the later very large array of light telescopes today, following the usual technological trajectory of more is better, but still remaining within the limits of light spectrum. This is the discussion with reference to Isaac Newton. Today's astronomy has now had the benefit of some 4 centuries of optical telescopy, the new astronomy. Now this is clearly different from Isaac Newton's time. New astronomy came after Isaac Newton. That's very clear here. Okay, Newton's time was not in the time of new astronomy. That's not considered new astronomy. New astronomy came much later, came much after Isaac Newton. So that is not a valid inference. Let's go back and check. They were not the earliest versions because new astronomy came in much later than Isaac Newton. This is not a valid inference. Remember, we're looking for a valid inference. Interventionist instruments, or instruments that intervene directly in scientific inquiry, which is connected to biotechnology, are different from embodied instruments or instruments that embody scientific inquiry. Now, this is a very trickily worded option. Okay, understand it. See, the distinction in the passage is between interventional instrumentation and receptive instrumentation. Telescopes versus, let's say, the instruments used for biotechnology. Embodiment is a very general term. Okay, both are embodied by technology. Both are embodied, both astronomy and biotechnology are embodied by technology and instrumentation, right? What this option is falsely doing is, it is creating a distinction between interventionist instruments and embodied instruments. Embodied instruments is a very generic term that applies to both. It applies to any science which has instrumentation. Embodied simply means that instruments give it a concrete form, that's it. So distinction is not between interventionist and embodied. Embodied is a very generic term, so this is false. This is not a valid inference. The author distinguishes between the receptive and interventionist uses of instruments, great, in the sciences by comparing astronomy and biology respectively. Now, astronomy is connected to receptive, absolutely correct. Interventionist is connected to biology, absolutely correct. Because of respectively, we have to check that as well. This is absolutely what the author is attempting to do. It's connected to the main idea as well, although this is not a main idea question. This is absolutely a valid inference. Okay. The advances in telescopy made by Newton with reflecting telescopes allowed early modern astronomers to observe the phases of Venus and satellites of Jupiter. Okay, let's check that. Observing the phases of Venus and satellites of Jupiter, was this discussed in connection with Newton? Let's go back. That discussion is somewhere here. Okay, so we are talking about this point. Galileo having learned of the Dutch invention, blah blah blah, and it was with his own telescopes that he made the observations launching early modern astronomy, phases of Venus, satellites of Jupiter. Okay, so Galileo is connected with that discussion. Okay, not Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton came after that. The discussion with observing the phases of Venus and satellites of Jupiter is connected with Galileo, not Newton. Now, they're very close. So, you have to be careful, come back and reread it, you'll understand that it's not connected. Let's go back. So, this is not a valid inference, the only valid inference is C, and the answer is C. Okay, this I would say is a time consuming question. I think it's a medium to difficult question, but time consuming because you have to go back and check. You should definitely attempt this, but quickly go back and check. Don't rely on your memory, otherwise you can make a mistake with this, and you'll have to like be very careful in rereading it. So, it's definitely time consuming. So, I would say medium to difficult, more towards difficult because of the consumption of time. Okay. Alright, let's look at question 3. Which one of the following observations is a valid conclusion to draw from the statement that the sciences involved today are highly instrumentalized and could not progress successfully without constant improvements upon the respective instrumental trajectories. Okay, so this of course has been directly lifted from the passage. You can go back and check if required. It is clearly talking about how instrumentation is a very important part of science, and sciences could not progress without constant improvements upon instrumentation. So, progress of instrumentation is very important for progress of science to happen, and the author has made that point very clearly. So, you go back and check. Let's actually quickly do that. It's always good to do that. Right, so somewhere here it says that yet in both disciplines the sciences involved are today highly instrumentalized and could not progress successfully without constant improvements upon the respective instrumental trajectories. Read it with context if required. If you've understood the passage, this should be clear. Now we have to look for an option that's a valid conclusion to draw from the statement. So the statement is clear, so rephrase it in your head as we have done. Progress in instrumentation is very important for progress in science. Okay, alright. A. The use of instruments in scientific trajectories must be respected in order to see successful progress in them. Must be respected. Now this can be an attractive option, but think about it. Are we talking about respecting the use of instruments in scientific trajectories? No. Respecting, like respect is different. That means you have to value it properly. You have to respect it. You have to give it due importance. That's not what the author is talking about. The author is making a very straightforward statement that progress in instrumentation is required for progress in science. This looks a little dubious because of respected, but we'll park it. Okay, let's go to B. In both astronomy and microbiology, progress has been the consequence of improvements in instruments they use. This seems better. Okay, progress in science is the consequence of improvements in instruments. That's what it's saying. Instruments have to be improved. Instrumental trajectories have to be improved for progress in science to happen. It's just rephrasing that statement. So we can cross this out, that respect is a problem there. Let's park this. Let's go to C. The growth of scientific technologies has led to the embodiment of progress in the trajectories of improvement. This option is completely distorted. It is not, we are not talking about embodiment of progress. We are talking about technological or instrumentation embodiment of sciences. Again, understand what embodiment is. Science is getting a concrete form because of instrumentation. That is embodiment. Okay, there is no embodiment of progress here, so it's completely distorted. Highly instrumentalized work in the sciences has resulted in the progressive improvement of scientific constants. Where is scientific constants coming from? There is no discussion. This is completely out of whack, out of scope. This is gone. The answer is B. I think in this passage, and it is a difficult passage with difficult questions, this question is manageable. You can get this question right. Okay. So I would say this is a medium question. Alright. This one is an interesting one. To which one of the following instruments would the characterization of instruments in the passage be least applicable? That's a broad question. We are talking about characterization of instruments. Now, how have instruments been characterized in the passage? Think about it. There are so many things being discussed. But the main thing is that we are talking about technological instruments. That's the main thing. Instrumentation here is connected to technology. We are talking about technological instruments. So, whether that's a telescope or whether that's a biotechnological instrument or whether that's computational machinery when it comes to mathematics, computers. We're talking about technological instruments, and these are instruments which impact science a great deal, because the author is making a very strong statement that progress or improvements in instruments is required for progress of science. So these technological instruments play a crucial role in the development of science. Those are the broad characterizations. Okay, let's look at the options. So we are looking for an instrument which would be least applicable based on these characterization of instruments. Milestone. All right. Now this is again, it also has to click. We also need to know what a milestone is, right? I mean, again, I don't think we use it very commonly in India. But milestones are, let's say you go on a road trip, okay, and you see like, okay, your destination is 100 kilometers away, 75 kilometers away, 50 kilometers away, 3 kilometers away. Those are milestones. Of course, they're called milestones, but they're kilometer stones, but we don't call them kilometer stones. That's a milestone. Is that an instrument? That's just a stone. There's no technology involved there at all. It's a stone, right? That's what a milestone is. Okay, it's a piece of stone with something written on it. It's not an instrument at all. So would it be least? It doesn't seem like an instrument at all, right? So let's park this. Scalpel. Now, scalpel is something that's used in biology. Right, doctors would use scalpel to perform a surgery, scientists would use scalpel to sort of, whatever subject matter is in front of them to investigate that. So scalpel is a sharp instrument and you can make cuts, right? That's probably used for surgery as well. Scalpel is an instrument, okay? Definitely as compared to milestone is not an instrument at all. Scalpel is definitely an instrument which can be used with biology. So we'll scrap this, especially because we have A. Kitchen oven. Kitchen oven is also an instrument in a way. I mean, there is technology involved there, right? This is where this question gets a little tricky, because scalpel, you might think, oh, where is the technology involved? Kitchen oven, you might think that, but okay, fine, can I really call it an instrument? It is an instrument, right? Because there is technology involved, there is science involved. So as compared to milestone, it's always relative. We'll cross it out. Saxophone, again, this might be like, oh, this is a musical instrument, but it's still an instrument. Okay, and as compared to milestone, definitely saxophone is out. So here, of course, in every question you have to be relative, but here it's very important to compare. Milestone is the odd one out here, definitely, because it's not an instrument by any reach, right? And that's why it's the answer. But yes, this is a tricky question, and a lot of students were thrown off by this question because it's weird. Like you probably wouldn't know what a milestone is, and again, you look at like scalpel and saxophone, and might think that they are not instruments as well. So one thing that you need to remember is, we always talk about eliminating options, right? And of course, that is the main strategy in CAT, right? You should always look to eliminate options, especially in VRC. But in some questions, you have to follow the reverse strategy. Instead of eliminating, you look at the options and you're like, I'm 100% confident this is the answer, but I'm not 100% confident of eliminating the remaining options. So in that case, you can take a calculated risk and say, okay, fine, I'm not able to eliminate it, right, because of the nature of the question and options, but I'm 100% sure that this is the answer. So sometimes that happens as well, and there's no sort of like what strategy fits when, just depending on the nature of the question. If elimination is proving to be very difficult, don't just always think about elimination. If elimination is not working and you see an option and like, I'm 100% sure this is an answer, and you're tentative about the other options, you can perhaps take a calculated risk, which is what's happening in this question. Okay, it's a difficult passage. Definitely, I think most students skip this passage in CAT 25 slot 2. The other 3 passages were better, but in this case, in terms of the questions, I think this is definitely I would say a difficult question, question 1. Question 2, I would say is medium to difficult. Question 3, I think is a medium question. Question 4 is a difficult question. So again, here 6 marks if you got, that would be considered as a solid attempt for this passage. But of course the question is, should you have attempted the passage if this was your exam? That's a different discussion. All right.